Call Lin-Manuel Miranda.
Michelle.
Hey, Lin, are you registered to vote?
Of course. I am not throwing away my opportunity to make my voice heard this November.
If we really want our voices to be heard, we need to vote in every election, not just for president, but for every office, school board, state house, senate, all of them. Can you help me get people registered?
Okay, I'm already on it.
Well, keep up the good work.
Let's see who else we can get on this.
Yo, Lynn, what up?
Hey, Chris, we're looking to field a full team to make sure every American casts their ballot this November. It's real easy from your phone or tablet to get the info you need to vote. Also, Michelle said so.
Well, I'm on it. There's no off-season for getting out to vote. Call Janelle.
No, not now. I'm registering voters. Hey, take this. 4 million Americans turn 18 this year. That's huge. And we need every last one of them to register and vote. Because let's be real. It's going to be the young people of this generation that will change the world.
It's time. Our nation requires it. Our democracy in the country we love requires our attention, voice, and participation.
When we vote, we prove that we are a democracy with a government of the people and by the people.
So every community we visit, it's important for them to know they can really make a difference if they go and vote in every election.
Absolutely.
So we're asking for your help. Help us start a conversation across America about being active participants in our most basic American responsibility, voting. Talk to your friends and family and neighbors. Tell them your hopes and dreams for your family, your community, and our country. When we all vote, we determine our future.
Good morning, and welcome to Annual Symposium. I am Reverend Tamara E. Wilson, Chair of the Commission, and it is my distinct honor to greet you here in this virtual space. The Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture, in keeping with our mission of documenting, preserving, and promoting Maryland's Black heritage today, we bring to you, in the midst of a worldwide pandemic, a virtual presentation on the power of the Black vote. It is my hope that today's program will encourage you to continue the legacy of countless African American heroes and sheroes who fought for the Black vote. On behalf of all the commissioners from around the state of Maryland, the staff of the Banneker-Douglass Museum, the Banneker-Douglass Museum Foundation, and friends, thank you again for joining us today. We are honored by your presence.
What would the state of Maryland's Black history be without the creation of the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture? Over 100 African American heritage sites throughout Maryland would have either closed or endured major despair. And also state advocacy towards African American preservation would suffer. In 1969, Senate Bill 185 established the Commission on Negro History and Culture to conduct a study of all proposals to create a better understanding and knowledge of Negro history and culture. MCAAHC was initiated by Senator Verna F. Welcome and historian Dr. Benjamin Quarles, and it became the first state ethnic commission in the country. Today, MCAAHC continues to discover, document, preserve and collect, and promote Maryland's African American heritage. Our offerings include research and advocacy, African American Heritage Preservation Grant Program, and the Banneker-Douglass Museum. When you consider your gift, think about the legacy that you want to leave for the next generation. This commission has been active for 50 years. Help us preserve Black history for the next 50 years and beyond. You can join as a sponsor, bequest, donate, visit africanamerican.maryland.gov to contribute. Special thank you to Banneker-Douglass Museum Foundation Incorporated and Friends of the Banneker-Douglass Museum.
Hi, I'm Adrienne Jones, Speaker of the Maryland House of Delegates. This year marks the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage and the 150th anniversary of suffrage for African American men. Voting is one of our most fundamental rights as Americans. Men and women fought hard to defend this constitutional right because your vote is your voice. With your vote, you get a say in how our country and communities are shaped. So I encourage everyone to speak up and cast your vote in this election. Regardless of how you vote this election, make a plan to vote because your life experiences matter, your voices matter, your representation matters.
Enough electoral votes, more than 270, more than enough to become the 44th President of the United States. He will be the first African-American President of the United States.
I've been broke all my life, but I kept hope all them nights. You see business in my city? Yeah, they closed all them twice. I was just riding down Salem, all them damn potholes, I can't drive. I know y'all can fix it faster, but I know y'all won't try. Don't nobody care about us, and that's why I don't vote. Voted for Obama back in 2012, I remember that's when I had hope. He was saying, yes, we can, and everybody got less food stamps. And when I turned 21, I was still broke, I'd never vote again. I don't think I ever had a president make my life better. Did it all on my own, ain't no politician ever do a nice gesture. I don't even know the mayor's name, I ain't never seen her one time ever. Tell me how she gonna help the city. What I'm supposed to do, write letters? What I'm supposed to do, blame Trump? He ain't never really gave a ain't nobody raised minimum wage. None of these jobs pay enough. I think they just wanna keep us broke, cause they ain't putting none in place for us. This how all my people feel, but we gotta learn. We complained enough, let me change it up. Everything I just said, everybody I know think the same way. See, they don't wanna see us vote, and we never do, so we see the same thing. But all our votes really do count, and they'll never really let it show. So now I'm finna break it down, cause if I don't, you would probably never know. First thing first, you know back in middle school when they taught us, it was 3 branches of the government. We forgot it when we got older. It's the judicial, the legislative, and executive. But all we know is the executive. That's the mayor, or the governor, and the president. Now none of them 3 people make no laws, they just be checking them. The laws come to their desk and all they do is say no or yes to it. So when the news station tried to tell us that Barack Obama couldn't put us on, we was all salty at Obama when it was the Congress members all along. We gotta focus on the legislative branch, yeah, they the ones that make the laws. Yeah, they the ones write how much food stamp money you get on the card. But when people that wanted to help us wanted the job, I know they probably lost. Cause we ain't even know their name, we ain't know their face, we ain't know it all. So the Congress or the State House, that's legislative, they make laws. So what we want from the president is what they do, okay y'all? See, they election every 2 years, but we don't ever even go to those. The Congress, they can raise minimum wage, but we ain't even really know it though. So you know how back in 08, when we all voted for Obama, we was all supposed to go back in 2010 and vote for the Congress. Cause they the ones make child support laws, they the ones choose if your kids at school get to eat steak or corn dogs. The State House make the court costs. So if the country failed, then you can't say it's them, it's your fault. Cause y'all ain't know to vote for Congress members that was for y'all. And they don't gotta leave after 4 years, and we just let them sit. See, they don't wanna tell you this, they want you to focus on the president. Now the 3rd branch is the judicial, that's judges. They the reason why John Crawford and Trayvon ain't had justice. So when Meek Mill got locked up just for popping willies, we blame the judge and not the city when they let her get voted in, cause they ain't know who to vote against. Imagine life on the other side. Roads better, schools better, everybody get their license back. Grocery store food better, custody of your kids back. Homeless people get new shelters. If we gon' fix the U.S., we gotta start with them 2 letters, me and you. Somebody told us that the government wanna keep us broke, but the only reason why those people in the government is cause we ain't vote. And I ain't talking about the president, I'm talking about the ones we ain't know. See, they was gonna try to keep it low, but it's gonna hurt them when they see the pros.
Every time you stay home, someone is making a decision about you, making decisions about the air you breathe, the water you drink, the food your kids eat, and how much money you bring home every 2 weeks. So every time you sit out an election, every time you don't show up because you think it doesn't matter, someone else is happy that you didn't show up, so they can make that decision for you. Vote.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lopez Matthews, and I am a commissioner on the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture. And I'm here today to talk to you about the Southern Negro Youth Congress and the battle for the Black vote. Now, the Southern Negro Youth Congress was a group of young people, college students, who came together to fight for civil rights. They came together in the 1930s when the Great Depression was happening and a lot of African Americans were suffering, and you really started to see an increase in direct action among African Americans. The group's founding can actually be traced to the National Negro Congress. And the National Negro Congress was a group of African American leaders who came together in an attempt to try to create a federation of civil rights groups. They thought that civil rights groups were kind of doubling their efforts and using up all the resources, and they felt that by coming together in a federation, they could save their small resources and do a better job in fighting for African American rights. The problem with the National Negro Congress was that they had a lot of communists involved in that organization. And as we sort of move through, we'll kind of learn about the problems that associating with communists had with these civil rights organizations, but they did not trust them. They were coming out of Russia, and they said, well, what really is their sort of issue supporting African Americans? And so the National Negro Congress did not get support. But one of the things to come out of that conference was the creation of the Southern Negro Youth Congress. There were about 200 young people who were at the conference, and they said, we should come together as a collective to create an organization. And so 3 months later, they came together, had a meeting at Howard University, and they developed a program of organization. And with that, they said, we're going to fight for African Americans throughout the South, because that's where most of the African Americans were. So they said, well, that's where we should focus. And so their first sort of home base was Richmond. And they first started working, trying to support workers' rights in Richmond. And they actually got equal pay for Black farmers in the city of Richmond, Virginia, which was an amazing feat, especially for a young organization full of young people. One of the things that the Southern Negro Youth Congress also set out to do was build partnerships with other civil rights organizations. One of the organizations that they were very close with was the NAACP. The NAACP had started a youth division, and they really said, well, if this group of young people are working here, then we really should work with them and combine our efforts. So that same idea and that same spirit that you saw in the National Negro Congress was really brought to fruition with the Southern Negro Youth Congress and the NAACP Youth Division coming together and really working together for that common goal of equality and equal rights for African Americans. They started marches together, they signed petitions together, and they really, really came together to support African American rights. As I mentioned to you, some of the affiliations of the Southern Negro Youth Congress would become a problem for them later, but really bringing together other organizations in support of Black rights was really a real sort of plus in the program of the Southern Negro Youth Congress. One of the things I want to mention before I move on from the founding of the organization was the fact that women were the driving force. Its female members organized the conferences, they supported the voter registration drives that I'm going to talk about, they supported the leadership schools. They were really the backbone of this organization. And so I just really wanted to make a point and say that to you. Sort of two of the really prominent female leaders in the Southern Negro Youth Congress were Esther Cooper Jackson and Augusta Strong. Esther Cooper Jackson was very active in starting the voter education campaigns, establishing the conferences, and she was very integral to the workings of the organization. Augusta Strong as well. She was very active in the organization and establishing their programs. She actually traveled to Cuba as part of the Southern Negro Youth Congress to assist them in building youth organizations to fight for the rights of Cubans. And so those are just really two of the female leaders in the organization. As we go along, you'll see pictures of the leaders of the organization. And just note the number of women that are in these pictures. That really let you know how active they were in this organization. Now, one of the major sort of parts of their program that they created at this meeting at Howard was supporting African Americans in the right to vote. It was very clear that the vote was important. And they said, you know, this is something that we need to fight against. Because African American men gained the right to vote with the passage of the 14th Amendment when they became citizens. It was supported by the 15th Amendment, which said that you could not deny someone the right to vote because of their race, which really then gave African American men the right to vote. And then you have African American women gaining the right to vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment. And so here you have this group of people who are citizens of the United States, but are being denied their right to vote through various laws that were passed. They included the poll tax, they included citizenship tests, they included literacy tests. And so this is where the Southern Negro Youth Congress focused part of their energies. And so one of the first things that they did was hold voter registration drives. They said African Americans had the right to vote. And so, you know, they should register to vote. And so as you see in this picture here, they would set up, encourage people to come and register people to vote. Now, whether that voter registration was accepted is another question. But they had African Americans come and register to vote to show that they were interested and to say, we are citizens of this country and we deserve to exercise our right to vote. And so they set up voter registration drives across the South. They started in Richmond, as I told you. Eventually they moved to Birmingham, Alabama, and made that the base of their operations. And they started to become very active in the Birmingham community, establishing these voter registration drives. Another area where they supported African Americans in their right to vote was in their active support of African American veterans. As African American soldiers are returning home from war in World War II, they are becoming beneficiaries of the GI Bill, which provided an array of benefits for veterans. And so they said, well, as veterans, these African American men should have their right to vote because they risked their lives for their nation. And so they met with the Veterans Administration. They said that they should be more actively involved in supporting African American veterans. And they also galvanized the African American veterans to march through the city of Birmingham to the Jefferson County Courthouse, showing their discharge papers and saying, hey, I risked my life for my country, I risked my life for this country, and so I should have my right to vote. And they had about 100 veterans participate in this march. Now, unfortunately, they were not given their right to vote, but they put the government on notice that they were no longer going to accept being denied their right to vote. And so the Southern Negro Youth Congress really galvanized them and said, you know, we will work with you, we will support you, and we will support you in getting your right to vote and also getting equal employment, also getting equal treatment, because they sort of fired on all cylinders in the support of African Americans. Another area in which the Southern Negro Youth Congress became active was in fighting the poll tax. Now, poll taxes were fees placed on voting throughout the South in an effort to stop African Americans from voting. Because many African Americans were poor, they often were not able to gather the money to pay this fee. And so they were then denied their right to vote. In supporting African American franchise, the Southern Negro Youth Congress founded the National Committee to Abolish the Poll Tax. And under this committee, they developed a series of petitions demanding African Americans have their right to vote and demanding the abolishment of the poll tax. They created an anti-poll tax week where they brought together various civil rights organizations to sort of develop their own petitions and send them in to the federal government saying the poll tax really needs to be abolished. One of the legislations that they chose to support was the Geyer anti-poll tax bill. And this bill would eliminate the poll tax throughout the nation. Unfortunately, this bill failed to pass, but it was a moral victory in that it brought together these various organizations to really focus on African Americans and voting. Another area in which African Americans needed help was the literacy test. Many Southern states put in place a literacy test where African Americans had to prove that they understood the Constitution. These tests were often arbitrary, and many African Americans were denied their right to vote, even though they clearly understood the Constitution and explained that to the election judge. Unfortunately, because they were African American, they were denied their right to vote and denied the right to register to vote. To help sort of counteract this, the Southern Negro Youth Congress established citizenship education classes. They developed a manual. They traveled around Birmingham telling people to come and register for this class. And they started with a group of ore miners and their wives, and they trained them in the Constitution, trained them really how to answer questions on these literacy tests. And the first group actually went, took the test, and they all passed. A total of 31 people actually passed out of this class. With that, the numbers skyrocketed with their citizenship education classes. And they actually had 2,500 people register for their next group. And interestingly, because of their work with veterans, most of that group were actually African-American veterans. And so here you have the Southern Negro Youth Congress, a group of young people training people to pass the literacy test. And so they're attacking sort of efforts to disenfranchise African-American voters on various fronts. They're using direct action, they're educating people, they're doing petitions, they're raising money to pay people's poll taxes. And so the Southern Negro Youth Congress really was actively involved in the fight to get African Americans their right to vote. The Southern Negro Youth Congress was brought to an end in 1948. One of the biggest groups that supported the Southern Negro Youth Congress was the Communist Party. In their campaigns for funding, in their campaigns for petitions, in their campaigns for voter education, they got a lot of support and a lot of money from unions and communist-affiliated organizations. They themselves were even accused of being a communist front. And there are some factors that show that maybe they were very closely associated with this Communist Party, but I personally do not believe that they were a communist front. I believe that they were very closely linked. They became very closely linked to the Communist Party because of its financial support, but I do not believe that they were truly a communist front. They also came under attack by Southern police departments. The name Bull Connor, Eugene Bull Connor, he comes to the forefront as he becomes the sheriff in Birmingham. He decides that he has had enough of the work of the Southern Negro Youth Congress. And so they begin to attack speakers at their 8th Southern Negro Youth Congress convention. The Southern Negro Youth Congress was an interracial organization. It was interracial from the beginning, and they always had a mix of blacks and whites speaking at their convention. They would have them on stage together. They would have blacks and whites intermingling. So the police in Birmingham actually raided the conference and shut it down. One of the speakers at the conference, a white speaker at the conference, was actually picked up by police, beaten up, and dropped off on the outskirts of town. He actually walked back into town to the church where the conference was happening. People saw him and they said, "What happened to you?" And his response was, "I was beaten up by the police and left on the side of the road." He was completely shocked. You have to remember that this is before television really showed what was happening to African Americans and how those who stood up for their rights were treated, how they were beaten, how they were assaulted, and how those who were allies to them were then also beaten and assaulted. And so for him and for other members at the conference, they were completely shocked. They were, "Oh my God, we can't believe you were assaulted." Their association with the Communist Party, though, was really probably the death knell for the organization. Young people who they invited to be a part of the organization declined, said they could not be associated with them because they were associated with communists. The House Committee on Un-American Activities started to investigate people who were associated with the Communist Party. They had their blacklist, and many African Americans, especially young African Americans, realized that they really could not afford to be associated with the Communist Party. And so in turn, they dropped out of the Southern Negro Youth Congress. And so this organization that was very active in supporting African American equality, equal pay, voter rights, they were essentially destroyed because of their association with the Communist Party. And so I really want people to remember that, you know, there was a group of young people very active in civil rights starting in the 1930s into the 1940s. And that this sort of era of active young people began much earlier than the 1960s, where, you know, we tend to typically place the activity of young college students. So this is a workshop. And so I want to leave you with some takeaways of things that you can do to support the right to vote for African Americans. And so one of the first things that I have here is start a campaign to register African Americans to vote. You can tell them where to go to vote, the website, their voter registration forms. You can be trained to register people to vote, but that's really all you have to do is really come together collectively and sort of encourage people to register to vote or register them to vote yourself. Another thing that you can do is develop an educational program to teach people about the importance of voting. A lot of people don't vote because they really don't understand the importance of it. They really don't understand the implications of not voting, and they really don't see their role in the voting process and their role in the political process. So you can develop an educational program to teach them about that. As a historian, I encourage you to also include history in that and talk to them about organizations like the Southern Negro Youth Congress or the NAACP and all of the people who risked their lives and even died for African Americans to get their right to vote. You can also teach people about the political process and how it works. Once they understand it, they understand their role in it, people will then vote. And then, of course, teach them about the role they play in politics. Who are you? Why are you not voting? And what does that do for the political process? For example, if you do not vote, they don't care what you think. And so why would they? You're not an active voter. They don't have to worry about losing your vote or gaining your vote because they know you're not going to vote. So teach people that if they become an active voter, those politicians will then care what they have to say. And let them know that if your right to vote and if voting really wasn't that important, there wouldn't be campaigns aimed at stopping you from voting. So that's really what I want to leave with you today. And I hope that you've learned a lot, particularly about the Southern Negro Youth Congress, but you've also sort of learned how, just a regular group of young people can assist in gaining African-American rights and equality and equity. So I hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and I wish that you would have a great day.
Hello, my name is Sabria Hassan, and I'm the Director of Programs at the Banneker-Douglass Museum. As you can probably imagine, the team and I spend a lot of time planning the museum's programs and events, so it only made sense that we create a plan for voting. To date, over 28 million people have already early voted. It's inspiring to know that the democratic process is alive and functioning in our country. If you have not done so already, creating a plan is easy. Here's a step-by-step checklist to get you to the polls on November 3rd. Number 1, I'm registered to vote. Hopefully by now you have already registered to vote. The deadline for the state of Maryland was October 13th. However, if you have not already registered, Maryland is a state that allows you to register and cast a provisional ballot the day of the election. For more information on this and other voter information, you can visit www.elections.maryland.gov. Number 2, I have identification just in case I need it. 3, I've researched my local races and ballot initiatives. 4, I've encouraged my friends and loved ones to register to vote and have created a plan with them. 5, I have saved the election protection hotline number just in case you experience any problems at the polls on the election day. Number 6, I've requested my mail-in ballot or located my polling place. 7, I have sent my ballot off and confirmed that it has been received. 8, I've spoken to my place of employment and shared with them my plans for voting on November 3rd. I've secured transportation, childcare, etc. Anything that could possibly be a hindrance on the day of has been thought out and taken care of. Number 9, you're ready to vote. Because on November 3rd, we want no voter left behind. We look forward to seeing you at the polls.
Why do I vote? Well, I vote for 2 really important reasons. First, my ancestors literally died so that I can have the right to walk into my polling location, pull that lever, and decide who I want to represent me. The second reason why I vote is because it is the single most important way that I can have my voice heard in this nation. So on November 3rd, I have my voting plan all mapped out, and I can't wait to exercise that right, and I hope to see you there.
Eddie Brown is a model citizen in many respects. His autobiography is called Beating the Odds, and it is a true page-turner because against all odds, he has made a success of his life, helping others along the way. Mr. Brown is the founder, chairman, and CEO of Brown Capital Management, an investment management firm that now manages over $15 billion in client assets. His firm has received the coveted Morningstar Manager of the Year and Lipper Fund Awards, among many others. Brown Capital Management was the second company owned and managed by African Americans to become a founding donor of the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture by donating $1 million. Eddie and his lovely wife Sylvia have gifted over an astounding $40 million to charity, many of which empower persons of color. Specifically, they have made several 7-figure charitable donations to Baltimore institutions. A few examples: $6 million plus to the Turning the Corner Achievement Program, $6 million for the Brown Center at MICA, $1.5 million to Center Stage, $1 million to the Reginald F. Lewis Museum, and $1 million to the Twigs program at Baltimore School for the Arts. Last year, they set aside $3.5 million to endow the Baltimore Museum of Art's chief curator, who is a woman of color. Eddie Brown holds a Bachelor of Science and Master's degree in Electrical Engineering from Howard University and NYU, an MBA from the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University, and honorary degrees from Johns Hopkins University, MICA, Howard University, McDaniel College, and Morgan State University. He and his wife have served as members of the prestigious Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Please enjoy this interview with noted Maryland Griot Commissioner Janice Curtis.
Good morning. Like Commissioner Pega said, we have with us today Eddie Brown of Brown Capital Management. I am Janice Curtis Green, Commissioner on the Maryland Commission for African American History and Culture, representing Baltimore County. Mr. Brown, good morning. Thank you for being with us today and for you to share your views on the importance of the Black vote. And I want to thank you for all that you do for Maryland and for Baltimore and for African Americans in general. Your story is indeed an inspiration to all of us. All right, since you have built this incredible career in finance and investments, can you share with us today how the Black vote and political participation can further financial opportunities for African Americans? And as you put it so eloquently in your op-ed for the Washington Post, dismantle inequities that make careers such as yours the exception rather than the rule.
Yeah, Janice, this election is one of the most important of our lifetimes. My wife and I have supported a lot of political candidates over the years, but this one is so important that we said we're going to help various candidates. We're going to help raise money, which we've never done. And we kind of stepped outside of our comfort zone. And we said we're going to hold a fundraiser for a candidate running for the U.S. Senate, happens to be Black. Not only that, but we're going to encourage all of the people that we know, starting with our family, to say, we had a caption that said, if not now, when? This is going to affect not only ourselves as Black people, but also future generations. As we see the Supreme Court nominee, the appointment is a very important factor, and everything depends on who controls the Senate, who controls the House, and it's so important. So not only are we helping a specific candidate by doing fundraising, but also we are helping candidates in 4 states running for the U.S. Senate. Our goal is to help flip the Senate. So this is a very important election. And we didn't know what else we could do, so we called a good friend who helped President Obama. In fact, he was one of the largest fundraisers nationally for President Obama both times. And we asked him, what could we do? We're not big folks, but we can do something. And he made an amazing suggestion, and he said, I would do something significant with the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, because they are putting infrastructure in place on a national basis to get out the vote. And he went through all of the great things that they're doing. So basically, we've gone all out. And we hope that all of the people who are watching this and people that they know, that we encourage everyone to not sit on their duffs, but get out and vote, bring all of their friends, relatives, who else they can contact to vote the right way in this election.
That vote, so many people have died, so many people have fought. It is a shame to waste the one thing that makes the United States special, a free and democratic vote. In your autobiography, you give a lot of credit to your grandparents, especially your grandmother, for encouraging you to imagine a life on the other side of manual labor. She was the catalyst that caused you to see beyond where you were and see a better future. How do you envision a future for African American communities in Baltimore? Now, I specifically say Baltimore because of all the work that you've done in Baltimore and because of the current challenges Baltimore City is facing.
Yes, Baltimore City, we are pulling for Baltimore. We've spent many, many years here, and we're doing everything we can to help the city. In looking at philanthropy, giving, we think education is a key to future success. So we put a lot of time and energy in helping education. For example, probably 15 or more years ago, we started a program and we decided to do an entire middle school. And it was not just about the impoverished community that was being served, but it was about offering insights to a better future. So we're doing the whole school, and it's kind of a complete wraparound. Working social workers, working with the family unit, if they need jobs, if they need other support services, these are being provided. The children are being shown something outside of their immediate surroundings. So they're taken to the symphony. They're taken to museums. They're taken to college campuses, historically black colleges, to say, if you do well educationally, there's a big world, a better world than your immediate surroundings. So we think kind of offering insights, inspiration to young African Americans will go a long ways towards improving Baltimore and basically the nation with inspired new talent. The other thing that we focused on is health in poor communities. And we were astounded, maybe it was 15 or more years ago, when we found out about those 2 zip codes in Baltimore City where the life expectancy for communities, 20 years difference between those 2 zip codes and some of the more affluent areas of Baltimore City, like Guilford, like Homeland. The difference? Education and poverty. So we set out to see what can we do in a small way to change that trajectory. So one thing we did, my wife Sylvia just stepped down after 15 years on the advisory board of the #1 school of public health in the world, and that's the Bloomberg School at Johns Hopkins. And we set up a program, and we said we're going to offer fellowships. Bloomberg School, graduate, master's, PhD. So we said we're going to offer the best fellowship at the Bloomberg School, Public Health, to attract students interested in improving health outcomes in poor communities, starting in Baltimore City. And that was 15 years ago. So we've now had 20 graduates, 5-year PhD program operating not only in Baltimore, but in other impoverished communities around the country, seeking to improve health outcomes. So we're looking for kind of major impact areas, and we think improving health outcomes in our poor communities, starting in Baltimore, providing a pipeline educationally, would be something that would be very important for us to do with our few nickels and dimes, and that's what we've been focused on.
That is so wonderful, because many young people, I grew up in Baltimore City, do not have the opportunity to see anything beyond that life. They don't think it's possible to go to college. And my husband made a statement the other night when we were talking about the problems in Baltimore City, and he said that comes from a people who have no hope.
Right.
When you lose hope, then why try? And so the programs that you and your wife, your college sweetheart, Sylvia, is so important, because you give people hope. You asking them to look beyond the break, look beyond where they are, and see that there's a bright future ahead, which makes you an inspiration. So other than your grandmother, who we already know is your inspiration, how do others in a position such as yourselves create opportunities to inspire other African American youth?
Yeah, I think those of us who have been fortunate should become mentors to other young African Americans. And I've spent countless hours, I've encouraged people that I know to spend countless hours basically talking with young African Americans, kind of taking them under their wings to show them kind of the path to a better future. I think that would probably be the most important thing that I can encourage people to do. And that's what we're interested in doing.
Thank you. And if I got anything, it is to have people, because not everybody has $1 million, but you got 10, maybe you have 5, maybe you have 100,000. You have to do whatever it takes, and not sit around and wait for somebody that you can get $1 million. Do it, add to the progress of your people in whatever way you can.
Right.
And I think Eddie Brown of Brown Capital Management, by your life, your struggle, your victory, your generosity, you inspire other people to be an inspiration, to aspire to inspire. And so that is the takeaway, to aspire to inspire. And that's what I think we should all do with our lives. I thank you. I think that's what you've done. You are an inspiration, and continue to do what you've been doing. Thank you for all that you've done for, I can pigeonhole you to Baltimore, but I mean to all Africans born in America. And the art produced by African Americans. And I thank you so much. I thank your wife, Sylvia. I thank Brown Capital Management and your foundation for all that you've done. And thank you for being a part of our Black Vote Symposium for the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Courage, my soul, and let us journey on. Though the night is dark and I am far from home, to God, the morning light appears. The storm is passing over. The storm is passing over. The storm is passing over. Hallelujah. 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 Ha, 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 ha. The storm is passing over. The storm is passing over. The storm is passing over. Hallelujah. Thunder rolling and billows shake the ground. See the lightning flashing and dark clouds all around. Jesus walked the seas and calmed the angry waves. The storm is passing over. The storm is passing over. The storm is passing over. Hallelujah. 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 Ha, 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 ha. The storm is passing over. The storm is passing over. The storm is passing over. Hallelujah.
When I was much younger, my grandmother, Vashti Murphy, whose picture you see in the background, told me of how she and other co-founders of Delta Sigma Theta sorority marched in the Women's Suffrage March of 1913 for women's right to vote. There have been so many marches and demonstrations, and people have died so that we might have that right to vote. And while that is important, what I want us to know in 2020 is that people are still dying. So that's why we must vote. We must vote for those who will represent our best interests, whether it's in the White House or Congress or the State House or city government or judgeships. Voting is important. So that's why I'm voting on November 3rd. I hope that you will join me, whether you mail in the ballot, whether you vote early, whether you show up on November 3rd, whatever you do, let's vote. Let's vote to make a difference. Let's vote to make a change.
Good afternoon. My name is Edwin T. Johnson, and I am one of the commissioners representing Baltimore City on the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture. We hope that you've enjoyed the Black Vote Symposium thus far, and it's our hope that you will leave at the end of the day motivated, encouraged, educated, and inspired. This is a most important election, and we hope that the information presented to you today will equip you with all the information necessary for you to know that it is imperative that you exercise your right to vote.
Why do I vote? I vote because countless Americans have died for this right. I vote because as an immigrant, I know what it's like when your democracy is in peril. I vote because I have 3 children whose lives count on the decisions I make today. I vote because I care. Make sure you do the same. Our power is our vote. Make sure you use it.
Hi, my name is Chanel Compton, Executive Director of the Banneker-Douglass Museum, your state museum of African American history and culture in Maryland. Today we're located at the Banneker-Douglass Museum, located right on Franklin Street in historic Annapolis, right up the road from the Maryland State House. Join us today where we'll be learning about our powerful exhibitions, our programs, and our profound history. Thank you. So here we are at the Black Vote Mural Project exhibition, an exhibition that features 16 murals completed by local artists throughout the region. The exhibit is an interpretation, an artistic exploration of African Americans in the vote. We were inspired to do this exhibition due in part to ASALA, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History's annual theme, African Americans in the Vote. This mural is entitled Three Graces, and it is by Maryland artist Brandon Donahue. Brandon Donahue is the David C. Driscoll Center Artist in Residence, and he works in the medium of paint and sculpture. This mural depicts civil rights activists Fannie Lou Hamer, Victoria Jackson Gray, and Annie Devine. These incredible women were organizers and founders of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. In this image, you can see to your left Fannie Lou Hamer, a Mississippi sharecropper turned civil rights leader and the voice of the movement, and she also went on to run for Congress. In the middle is Victoria Jackson Gray, who was a school teacher turned civil rights leader and was the first Black woman to run for Senate in Mississippi. And to your right, Annie Devine, who was an insurance executive and later civil rights leader. In this image, the three women are reading a telegram at the U.S. Capitol building in 1965. The telegram was from the Speaker of the House, granting them permission to be seated on the House floor during the debate about the newly elected representatives from Mississippi. The mission of these women was to unseat the all-white congressman from Mississippi, who they claimed were elected illegally because of discriminatory voting practices. They charged that because Blacks were kept from registering, the election was fundamentally unfair. Their effort was called the Mississippi Challenge and led to calls for congressional investigations into voting in Mississippi. Thus, the three women's activism fed into the groundswell that produced the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The title of the mural references a painting by Renaissance artist Raphael entitled Three Graces, featuring three young women who represent charm and beauty. Though this mural is a realistic rendering of the original photo in 1965, Brandon includes red, white, and blue to symbolize patriotism. A major focal point in the mural is the use of red on the telegraph. Red symbolizes intensity, blood, life, urgency, which illuminates the grave importance of this message. These women fought to throw open the doors for Black women in politics and activism. In this mural, Brandon Donahue beautifully and poetically honors them for their courage and sacrifice. This mural is entitled For Those Who Came Before and is by Maryland artist LaToya Peoples. The mural features a contemporary young woman of African descent positioned in front of historic images of protesters who fought for the right to vote. As you can see, the central figure wears a t-shirt that pays homage to the Black Lives Matter movement and voter rights for Black citizens today. The background depicts images from the civil rights marches in the 1960s and the signing of the Voting Rights Act. In defiance of segregationist oppression, the civil rights marches were organized by nonviolent activists to demonstrate African American citizens' constitutional right to vote. The flags in the background is a reinterpretation, a remix, if you will, of the iconic painting entitled Flag by American pop artist Jasper Johns. But in this interpretation of the flag painting, LaToya Peoples in this mural allows the red of the flag to drip, conveying blood, sacrifice, and violence. LaToya Peoples is a Baltimore-based multidisciplinary artist and educator. She works in the realm of mixed media, painting, and public art. Her work focuses on the figure, color, and pattern as a way of exploring identity, history, and transformative themes. I especially believe that this painting is compelling because it brings the history of voting rights for African Americans from the civil rights marches to today, and how the right to vote is still being protested by a new generation of activists and change agents. So today we're in the temporary gallery at the Banneker-Douglass Museum, and we're going to be looking at two murals that are included in the Black Vote Mural Project. The mural behind me is by the artist group Future History Now. They're a local arts nonprofit in Annapolis, and they specialize in public art, working with young people and other local artists throughout the community. In this public art piece, you see, or should I say mural piece, you see an image of Mary Church Terrell, you see images from the 1965 Voting Rights Act protest, and you even see an image of, which I think is a really interesting addition to this piece, an image of Edmonia Lewis, who was a famed African-American woman sculptor, a leading sculptor during the early 1900s. So there's a lot of different images. I would even say layers of collaged images and colors going on to tell a really profound story. So you see an image of the American flag, you see the Maryland flag, you see the central piece, which I think is really important to focus on. Your vote is your voice, which is something that we need to continue to remind ourselves in our community. So this is a really special mural at the Banneker-Douglass Museum. It's entitled Evolution of Efficiency. It is completed by students from Bowie State University at their fine arts department. So they're fine arts students, so to speak. And in this mural, it's a multimedia art piece. So they use different types of materials to create this piece. What I love about the mural, and when you come on down to the Banneker-Douglass Museum, you really see the detail in, I would even say, wallpaper that they created. So they use digitalization to design and create this really fascinating wallpaper that depicts Black protests in the 1960s. And on top, they hand-painted portraits of African-American heroes and sheroes, of many of whom, of course, we know today, such as Shirley Chisholm, Frederick Douglass, Thomas Peterson, who was the first African-American man to be recorded to have voted in the United States, as well as Mary McLeod Bethune. I hope you've enjoyed this brief tour of the Black Vote Mural Project. You can learn more about this project and see more artwork by other artists by visiting us online at bdmuseum.maryland.gov. I encourage you to also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube to see more of what we have to offer. If you've enjoyed this exhibit and want to support the work we are doing, please consider donating at the Banneker-Douglass Museum Foundation by clicking the donate button on our website. Thank you for joining us today and for supporting the Banneker-Douglass Museum. your state's official museum of African American history and culture.
What is the history of voter suppression?
I'm Congressman Kwesi Mfume, and I've been asked to take a few moments by the Commission to reflect on the matter of Black votes and how do Black votes matter in the middle of this pandemic and an election that is so consequential as this one. You know, the effort to suppress the vote is not new. It really began many, many years ago when our great-grandparents were coming up from slavery. And in those days, the bigots and the people who were running things decided to create, as a suppression method, something called the grandfather clause, which said you can't vote unless your grandfather voted. But of course, your grandfather was a slave and didn't vote, and therefore you were deemed ineligible. Those same persons developed shortly thereafter something called literacy tests, which said you had to be able to tell how many bubbles were in a bar of soap just to be deemed eligible and intelligent enough to vote. As horrendous as that might seem, those things were the way it was many, many years ago. So today, there are new suppression efforts. Those efforts are aimed at getting people not to vote by, first of all, indicating to them that they have nothing to vote for. It's a waste of time. They're also hampered by the fact that the Voting Rights Act, which was passed after the 1960s to ensure Justice Department certification of elections, has continued to sit on the desk of Senate Leader Mitch McConnell, and there is no action at all on behalf of his part to pass it. And you see things taking place where governors around the country are reducing the number of polling places, particularly as the case in Texas, to make it much more harder to vote and much more of an effort to suppress things. We learned long ago that people who do not vote have no line of credit with the people who are elected, and therefore they pose no threat to those who work daily against their interests. The efforts recently to suppress and to intimidate the Postal Service was another effort designed at keeping those same people from voting. The intimidation efforts that are taking place around the country that so many groups and legal minds have been fighting against are also efforts. So Black votes matter, but Black votes matter if in fact they are cast. Elections have consequences, and we don't want this election to come and go in such a way that those tactics work and we end up giving ourselves a future and elected officials that we don't want or need. So I would urge everybody to recognize that in this era, there are new efforts to suppress the vote, and to recognize also that we must do what we can while we can and how we can to make sure that doesn't happen. Please vote, have a plan to vote, and please vote early.
Who are some African American leaders who fought for voting rights in Maryland?
My name is Maya Davis, and I bring you greetings from Prince George's County, the county for which I serve on the Maryland Commission for African American History and Culture. Today, I would love to talk to you all about my personal history with voting rights and bring you into the 2020 era. My personal connection to voting rights dates back to the early 1900s when my great-great-grandparents, Lionel and Anita Roberts, were staunch advocates of voting rights in the United States Virgin Islands. When the islands were transferred to the United States from Denmark, Black citizens did not have the right to vote there. So the citizens there, some of the leading figures, such as my great-great-grandfather Lionel Roberts and his wife Anita, actually went before Congress several times to launch and advocate for their community to have voting rights. He was a member of the Virgin Islands Commission, as well as the father of the Organic Act. Fast forward to today, when I work for the Maryland State Archives in the Study of the Legacy of Slavery program, which helps to document the voices of African Americans from slavery to freedom. Typically, we highlight the stories of individuals such as Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, but we also are sure to focus on many others who are voiceless. In that study, we look at the impacts of voting rights on the community here in Maryland, where Frederick Douglass was an advocate for voting rights and helped to launch the efforts that led to the passing of the 15th Amendment. Harriet Tubman is another figure from Maryland who actually worked diligently with the women's suffrage movement, and other figures such as Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and many others that are unknown, but we'd like to highlight these stories as well. Representing Prince George's County, I am proud that we are one of the first places in the country to vote in an African-American woman as county commissioner, Mrs. Angela Also Brooks. In Prince George's County, we still do other diligent work to help impact African-American communities, both locally and nationally. Today, we have a commission that is actually reviewing the names of the schools in which our children attend. Many of the schools are named after former slaveholders and individuals who should not be having their names upheld on buildings that are educating African-American children and other ethnic minorities. So please work with us today to make sure that our children can go to school where they can be proud of the individuals whose names are emblazoned above their heads when they walk into school. Thank you for all that you do, and be sure to get out and vote. Thanks.
Why is the history of the Black vote so important?
My name is Dr. Iris Slade Barnes, and I am with the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture, and I represent the Harford County, Maryland area. I'm going to just talk a little bit about the importance of this commission and how it can help guide social justice movements, and a little bit about Maryland's history and the importance of the vote today to make changes. So why is this commission so important? Well, first of all, our first goal is to preserve African American historic sites. That's an important goal, but keep in mind those sites tell a story. So they're really sites of memory. And oftentimes those stories are related to slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, because those systems of racism are embedded, woven into the American fabric. So these places tell those stories, right? So while we are preserving the sites, we are preserving those stories. And beyond just telling how they came into existence because of those systems, we're also telling the stories of perseverance, resilience, and how African Americans survived and thrived through all of that, through all of those obstacles. And then so when we're telling those stories, we're also telling ways that they overcame. So we can learn from that. We're giving ourselves hope. Hey, if we came through that, we can definitely come through whatever's going on today. And so we learn from those stories. Number one, we're keeping that history alive. You start with the truth. We can't let that history get erased or forgotten. It's important that we keep it alive or get rewritten. I've seen stories get rewritten just to kind of make them look like it's a kinder history. This is our history. We have to embrace it, whatever it is, and really get out of it the story of our resilience and perseverance and our strength as a community. And so also, when we look at these systems, we can think about, when we look at today, we see some things like disparity in the schools and jobs and communities. And we look at this history, we can find out how to dismantle some of these systems that are impacting us today. Our society isn't just the way it is happenstance, it's because of these systems. And so it's important that we apply these lessons, learn from it, dismantle it based on how it was begun. I'd also want to talk a little bit about how people refer to Maryland as up south. And they often want to say, well, you know, because it was a border state on the Mason-Dixon line, slavery was a little mild. I've heard so many people say slavery was mild in Maryland, I can't tell you how many. But think about that. The records, documentation, and stories of people who lived through it, like William Still's book, The Underground Railroad, documents stories of freedom seekers from Maryland who talk about Maryland slaveholders and their harsh treatment. Levi Coppin wrote his book, Unwritten History, which are his memoirs. While he was not enslaved, he knew enslaved people. He talked about how every Monday morning, slaveholders would beat their slaves to remind them that they were enslaved, and so that they would not even consider or think about running away. So in many ways, being on the Mason-Dixon line was cruel, extra cruel. So I want to dismantle that myth of Maryland being mild with slavery. Also, you have to remember that the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by President Lincoln in January 1863. But Maryland, almost 2 years later, finally ended slavery in November 1864. So it held on to it. It wasn't ready to let it go. While it maybe didn't rebel against the Union, it did hold on to slavery. And so that's important to know. But also within that same Constitution, they passed or they provided for public education, but just for white students, not for black students, but everyone, including blacks. The taxes from everyone was used to support those schools. So blacks didn't have school, but they're paying taxes for white schools. Then when it was time to get black schools, only the property taxes and taxes from African Americans were used to support the black schools. Keep in mind, blacks were prevented from owning property, had lower jobs, are relegated to segregated and poor communities. So how much taxes were there to support these schools? So it's important to think about the vote. This was voted that way. So if we vote today, remember, today, your vote is so important. People died, whole communities were burned out, black communities were burned out because of political issues. We can't forget Wilmington, North Carolina. We can't forget so many places such as that where towns were burned out because those in oppression, who oppressed the black folks, whites, wanted to maintain power. And so, you know, you have threats today of if the current president doesn't win again, there will be violence. And so we think about that. That's historically has happened. And so we need to make sure that we are out there voting. People have died. People have risked their lives. Communities burned, churches burned, schools burned for education. So those two things, education and voting, are so important because they advance us. And if there are people who want to keep you from getting it, then you know it's because of the power in it. So understand the power of your vote to prevent these things and to make changes.
How did post-Reconstruction impact black voting rights?
Hello, my name is Russell Frisbee. I'm Vice Chair of the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture. As I talk to you today with a picture of the United States Capitol in my background and thinking about how many people have died to preserve our right to vote, I'm not going to focus on that. Instead, I am going to talk about my great-grandfather, Lewis Clay of South Carolina. Now, I didn't know much about him because my grandmother got out of South Carolina as soon as she reached legal age. The only thing I knew about him was that it was said that he was somehow descended from Henry Clay. I guess Henry Clay was a great compromiser in more than one way. In any event, several years ago, I decided to Google him. And when I did, in some obscure place, I ran across an affidavit he had sent to the South Carolina Supreme Court in 1876. Apparently, my great-grandfather was very active in Republican politics during the Reconstruction. He was so active that he became an elector in the 1876 election, one of the people who was supposed to cast their votes in the Electoral College. And the affidavit, however, told a terrible story. It told how my great-grandfather and his compatriots were driven out of South Carolina by white people shooting guns at them so that they couldn't cast their vote for the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes. Now, for those of you who don't remember, 1876, that election resulted in the infamous Hayes-Tilden Compromise, which is still haunting us today. Tilden was a Democratic candidate. He won the popular vote. Hayes was a Republican candidate. He was at least tied in the Electoral College. So the Republicans and the Democrats made a deal. The deal was that the Democrats would vote for Tilden, and in return, the Republicans would pull the Union troops out of the South. Those are the troops that had been protecting black people, and in essence, let white Southerners do whatever they wanted to black people throughout the South. Now, remember that at that point, the majority of voters in South Carolina were black. However, their votes didn't count because my grandfather and others couldn't vote in the Electoral College. Then when I thought about this, I went back and I flipped the page to the front page of the affidavit, and I saw it said, never considered by the South Carolina Supreme Court. Never considered by the South Carolina Supreme Court. Today, particularly today, I wonder what would have happened, what kind of world we would live in if my grandfather's vote and all the votes of the black people in South Carolina had been counted in 1876. We'll never know. But the one thing we do know is that all our votes count. We should all vote and make sure our votes count. Go out and vote. Thank you.
Hi, I bring you greetings from the Banneker-Douglass Museum Friends and the Banneker-Douglass Foundation Museum Incorporated. I am Burl Hall, and I am the chair of the Banneker-Douglass Museum Foundation. As you know, we're in the midst of the largest civil rights movement in our nation's history. Everyday people, teachers, students, parents, artists of all backgrounds are using their voices to educate and inspire social change for Black citizens and all communities of color. As Maryland's official museum of African American history and culture, Banneker-Douglass Museum is the forefront of these efforts to embrace anti-racism and dismantle racist policies and systems. But we cannot do the work without your help. Our community outreach, the Breonna Taylor Mural Project and the Black Vote Mural Project reach far beyond the museum's doors. The Banneker-Douglass Museum serves as a hub for historic preservation and a resource for social change and racial equality for all Marylanders. We are making great strides and positively impacting communities across the state. But your help is essential to continue our momentum. As a supporter of social change and racial justice, we ask that you consider donating to our expanding anti-racism initiatives that will include free anti-racism teacher and community trainings, exhibitions, public art projects, annual youth conferences, and much, much more. With your help, we can meet our goal of $80,000 by year's end. Together, we have the power to effect real and positive change that will improve the lives of all Marylanders for generations to come. So today, we ask that you visit us at bdmuseum.maryland.gov and click donate to support the Banneker-Douglass Museum and all of its programs. Thank you so much.
Why do I vote? I vote because I can. Why do I vote? I vote because I must. There's power in the vote. There's change in the vote. There's the future in the vote. Don't give away your power. Don't give away the change you want. Don't give away your future. Vote.
Greetings. My name is Commissioner Eleanor Thompson, and I'm one of Maryland Commissioners on African American History and Culture, appointed by Governor Larry Hogan. I proudly represent Anne Arundel County. Ida E. Jones is the first university archivist at Morgan State University. She is the author of 4 books, most recently Baltimore Civil Rights leader Victorine Q. Adams, The Power of the Ballot, which won 2019 African American Historical and Genealogical Society's International Biography Book Award. A native of Cambridge, Massachusetts, he graduated from Howard University with a BA in News Editorial Journalism, a Master's of Art in Public History, and a PhD in American History. For her dedication archives, Dr. Jones earned Emory University's first Carter G. Woodson Research Fellow in 2007. In 2020, she was awarded an IMLS Museum Grant for African American History and Culture. And the Library of America Lift Every Voice, Why African American Poetry Matters. In 2019, she was awarded the Authenticity Project Fellowship from the HBCU Library Alliance and Digital Library Foundation and a Schlesinger Library Oral History Grant. She is involved in a variety of professional organizations and was recently appointed to the board of National Collaborative for Women's History Sites. Dr. Jones is currently co-vice president of the Baltimore City Historical Society. She has appeared on CSPN, National Public Radio, BBC Radio, and in numerous printed and digital publications, including her blog posts, Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission, Mary McLeod Bethune, True Democracy, and the Fight for Universal Suffrage. Dr. Jones is a consummate scholar who believes deeply in the words of Mrs. Mary McLeod Bethune, who stated, "Power must walk hand in hand with humility, and the intellect must have a soul." It is with pleasure that I present our keynote speaker, Dr. Ida Jones.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Commissioner Thompson and Commissioner Green, and special thanks to Dr. England Wilson, Chair of the Commission on African American History and Culture for the state of Maryland. I appreciate the invitation to join you on today to discuss the sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary of the 50th Amendment, and the centennial anniversary of the 19th Amendment in terms of our commemoration on this afternoon. I would also like to dedicate this presentation to the legacy and memories of the late Dr. Roland McConnell, Dr. Benjamin A. Quarles, and Dr. Rosalind Torborg Penn of the Legacy Department of History at Morgan State University. As we know, your commission was founded by the visionary impact of the late Verda Welcome and Dr. Benjamin A. Quarles and the culture and impact of Morgan State. So it's a very symbiotic relationship, and I'm happy to be here to celebrate our heritage, history, and culture. I will now go to share my screen so we can go through the presentation on this afternoon. The formal title of my presentation is African American Democracy Requires Eternal Vigilance, the Long Struggle for the 15th and 19th Amendment. That introductory title comes from a speech given by Dr. Dwight Oliver Wendell Holmes of Morgan State University, president from 1937 to 1948, in an article he wrote, Requiring the Negro and Democracy. So we're looking at the African American franchise or the vote, and we're celebrating 150 and 100 years of two constitutional amendments, the 15th Amendment in 1870 and the 19th Amendment in 1920. Pictured here are two Maryland natives, Frederick Douglass and Francis E.W. Harper. African Americans from the state of Maryland figured very prominently in the national discourse on the franchise, not just solely for African American men in the 19th century, but also in the 20th century with the 19th Amendment. So you as Marylanders should have a special banner of pride in regards to that legacy. The presentation will follow as accordingly. I'll explore four areas: the term citizen, the 15th Amendment, the 19th Amendment, and the Voting Rights Act. Pictured to the right of your screen is the Crisis, or cover of the Crisis magazine from August 1915. This is a seminal piece of literature that you can explore because it looks at votes for women. And W.E.B. Du Bois, this is the national organ of his NAACP, and there are a number of essays, both by men and women, discussing the need to enfranchise women. So the definition of a citizen will examine the birth of a nation, the rise of states' rights, and free African Americans. We will then discuss the 15th Amendment, the abolition or abolitionists, women's rights, and the fight for the franchise, Civil War, a fractured country, the language of the 15th Amendment. Pictured behind this is the march in 1870, the parade that was held in celebration of the passage of the 15th Amendment. Baltimore had over 10,000 persons in attendance, and behind that figure in the center of the picture is the Washington Monument. We'll discuss that later on as well. The 19th Amendment will look at Francis E.W. Harper, race over gender, the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, and the National, or NAWSA, National American Women's Suffrage Association, a shallow victory. Just to continue along the lines of education from left to right on this picture are the three generations of African American women suffragists. Starting to the left is Mary Ann Shadd Cary. Beside her is Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Center is Mary Church Terrell. Next to her is Nannie Helen Burroughs, and to her right is Daisy Lambkin. There are a constellation of names in both efforts for the 15th and the 19th Amendment that all of the names cannot be mentioned, so I try to include as many pictures and identifiers for you to go to further research. Then we will look at the Voting Rights Act. We will examine another Maryland native, Victorine Q. Adams, and her Colored Women's Democratic Campaign Committee, Hamer, Gray, and Devine, and the formation of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and then the federal legislation, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the federal protection. Just another tidbit from left to right on this picture is Fannie Lou Hamer, Victoria Gray Adams, and Annie Devine. So in probing any pattern of inhumanity, or any pattern of inhumanity, the proper place to start would be at the beginning. The legal process was able to set its conscience aside and by pragmatic toadying to economic needs rationalize a regression of human rights for Blacks. This is from A. Leon Higginbotham's seminal work in The Matter of Color. During the course of setting up the climate in which we're going to have birth the 15th Amendment, we need to understand the colonial era. Moment one, colonial America, the formation of a country. After the American Revolution, the struggle to form a federal government or confederation of independent states weighed heavily on the lawmakers. Moment two, the economic system rested on agrarian methods of physical labor fulfilled by enslavement of domestic and imported persons, but ultimately was fueled by African bodies and people. Moment three, the question of who is a citizen was principally a method to corral free African Americans, restricting their access to the ballot and voice in the fledgling democracy. Moment number four, the lack of enforced federal legislation allowed states to create their own constitutions, granting or denying the franchise. And moment five, all non-white, women, and property-less persons were not full citizens and subject to the whims of state governments inspired by economic interests. Birth of a nation rising from the ashes of rebellion, America sought to become a country. During the creation of the United States Constitution, the formation of the federal government, and the states, fix my screen here, and the states, the matter of suffrage for African Americans was discussed. It is interesting to observe that when our democracy was writing its beliefs into law, there was either direct opposition to or neglect of a definition of the voting status of Negro citizens. Many Negroes had exercised suffrage in the colonial period. They had served as soldiers in the colonial war. They were in the War of the American Revolution. They had owned property, paid taxes, were heads of household, and members of churches. But they were kept from the ballot boxes, even when most of the constitutions were made. With so little definition of the meaning of the term citizen, it is inevitable that misunderstanding should arise. This is from Charles Wesley's article on suffrage, and there is a bibliography at the end, so you can gladly collect all these sources to further your information and research. Looking at Wesley's article even further, he goes to discuss the idea of, indicate that government wanted to have limited power. So theoretically expressed, the operation of a central government was upon individual citizens. There goes that term yet again. The dignity and the worth of the individual were an inheritance from the American Revolution and the beginning of the age of the rights of man. The main problem left unresolved was whether the new government should operate through its own coercion or through sovereign states. The 1787 convention heightened the tensions between smaller and larger states, as well as between slaveholding and non-slaveholding representatives. This resulted in how to address enslaved populations. Were they people or were they property? If people, they were citizens. If property, how would other property be computed into terms of taxation? So it always goes back to money and power. So they concluded the enslaved populations were given a designation of mixed characters. So they were both persons at times and property at other times. Concurrently, free African Americans were free to inhabitants of a particular state and given the duality of citizenship under the United States Constitution. This opaque definition resulted in confusion about the status of free persons, and it would not be resolved until the 14th Amendment nearly 100 years later. So as we see the struggles that are happening contemporarily in regards to states nullifying federal law in terms of, let's say, formerly convicted felons who are now out of prison, they've been given the right to vote. Now they're saying, well, no, they've got to pay off their debt that they owe. So it's almost like a poll tax. So every state now is legislating what they want, seemingly nullifying federal law. We'll look at the 3 Civil War amendments that really seek to bring federal enforcement to this conversation. So this is the era in which we're focusing. At the same time in which we're now discussing who and what is a citizen and who and what is African American enslaved bodies, the rise of states' rights. Central government needed to be sovereign within its limited sphere, but it was clear that the states intended to be sovereign within their sphere. So you have a federal sphere of sovereignty, and then you have a state level of sovereignty. And they're almost parallel lines with no sense of connection, except territorial in regards to being on one landmass. In the state of Maryland, an act in 1783 was reenacted in 1801 and prohibited Negroes from voting, holding office, and giving testimony against white persons. Later, the right to vote was specifically restricted to free whites in 1802 and in 1810. The chilling effects of increased states' rights by the 1860s, free African Americans were effectively shut out of the ballot box. The fear of the power of the Negro vote and its alliance with the votes of others, and particularly poor whites, was an important factor. After the Civil War and Reconstruction, when the constitutions were again remade, the desire to restrict the votes of the Negroes was again made manifest. This is all from Dr. Wesley's article, which is extremely insightful because you see we're looking at the fruit. We are now in the orchard of which these seeds were planted, and they were fledgling saplings. We are now looking at full forests of ideological beliefs that we see played out in our national agenda. So we look at the idea of free African Americans living during the era of enslavement. They realized their precarious position, yet they endeavored to be citizens. And once again, Maryland native Frederick Douglass, who is quite the lion of the 19th century, delivers a speech in April of 1865 entitled, "What the Black Man Wants." And he says, "I am for immediate, unconditional and universal enfranchisement of the Black man in every state in the Union. Without this, his liberty is a mockery. You might as well retain the old name of slavery. And furthermore, Douglass goes to explore the definition of citizen. Once again, we're talking the close of the 19th century. In 1776, he was a citizen. At the time of the formation of the Constitution, the Negro had the right to vote in 11 out of the 13 states. In time of trouble, we are citizens. Shall we be citizens in war and aliens in peace? Would that be just? So this is the climate in which we're going to see the 15th Amendment conceived. While the fervor, African Americans and others continue to agitate for the franchise, preferably universal franchise. So now we come to the 15th Amendment, and pictured behind this are those individuals who were elected during the Congress in the 1870s after the franchise was given. So we have these African American legislators who are going to now open up for universal public education. They're going to look at taxation, they're going to look at land allotment, and their activities are going to shift the balance of power from one group of persons holding all the wealth, or the 1%, and seeking to distribute that amongst the 99, both the formerly enslaved as well as pre-Civil War free and poor whites and ethnics, whites and others who were in the country at the time. Once again, we have to look at 5 moments of time during this era. Moment 1, the 19th century in total witnessed the end of the international slave trade. The end of the international trade resulted in an increasing demand for the end of chattel slavery in America. Moment 3, the Second Great Awakening stirred Christian communities to start and promote reform movements to realign the country with its biblical intention. Moment number 4, the ideological rift between the lived and desired community resulted in fracture, leading to the Civil War. And finally, in moment number 5, the passage of the 15th Amendment, as well-intentioned as it might have seemed, was exploiting the fragile unities within the reform movements. This is going to greatly impact the women's movement along racial lines. So when we look at this time period of reform movements, we have to look at abolitionists and women's rights in particular, because those are the 2 areas in which we're focusing. So the Second Great Awakening, which was a religious experience during the mid-19th century, sought to expose the contradictions within American society. As we know, the Pilgrims came and the Puritans came, and they wanted to build a city on the hill and have this religious experience in, quote, the New World. Well, that really fleeted very clearly by the 2nd and 3rd generations of transplants and became more economically driven and capitalist in its focus. So the abolitionist movement really begins formally in the 1830s on the heels of 3 slave rebellions: Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, and Nat Turner. Black and white Christian leaders, formerly enslaved persons, and freeborn African Americans advocated for the end of enslavement. On the heels of that, it's going to morph into the women's rights movement. And by 1848, white women gather in Seneca Falls, New York, to declare an end to partial citizenship. They create a declaration of sentiments based upon the United States Declaration of Independence, listing unfair treatment they endured through being denied full citizenship, which was principally that vote, because they could get educated, they could get married, although they could not divorce, and there were other things that terminally kind of held their hands locked. These 2 movements in particular, along with the economic challenges, because there was about 2 economic depressions during the part of the 19th century, as well as increased immigration from both Europe and Asia, the America of the Founding Fathers had to expand to include all persons, residents within the land of liberty and the bastion of democracy. This would be no easy ask or immediate legislative concession that is brewing during the 19th century. One of the largest issues ideologically is going to be the Civil War. Let me go back here. That's fine. So the Civil War is going to lead to a situation in which we have a fractured country. The abolitionists, the suffragists, as well as select Christian preachers are going to advocate for moral accountability and forced inequity to the surface of the country. Their advocacy resulted in denominational splits between the Methodists, the Baptists, Presbyterians, and many other Christian denominations. The rising tide of dissension over enslavement and the increasing mechanization of industrial operations seemingly relinquished the agrarian method of money-making, anachronistic and outdated. It is essential to understand that the Civil War utilized the opportunity to shift the balance of economics to the mid-Atlantic and the North away from Southern plantocracies. Concurrently, those Southern plantations were seeking to go westward as the country acquired new territory. That expansion westward with that ideology of a plantocracy was threatening the idea of the federal government or the Union. So we have President Lincoln, who's pictured as the great emancipator. In fact, in August of 1862, in a letter to Horace Greeley, he says, if I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving the others, I would do that as also. There's a great discussion in Lerone Bennett's book, Forced into Glory, Abraham Lincoln's White Dream, which really goes into great detail about, let's looking deeply at the politics of Lincoln and not so much his moral propaganded image of him. Nevertheless, he paid with his life because he did offend individuals in terms of that plantocracy and money and power matter. Nevertheless, when black male suffrage becomes the focus of an enfranchisement amendment, white women shifted their tactics. They were joined by select blacks like Robert Purvis, who had two daughters who were very much involved in suffrage movements, but he was against it because there was a point where the 15th Amendment could have been given universal suffrage. So all individuals, the non-property owning, women, and landless poor would have been allowed to have the vote. But what they're going to do is they're going to swing this and make it simply for men only and uninclude women. And white women are very angry about that. So white suffragists appealed to the Democrats. At that time, the Democratic Party was a principally Southern plantocracy party, and they were affirming their beliefs in black inferiority. And in 1868, Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote, think of Patrick and Sambo, the African-American, and Hans, a Dutch-American, and young Tung, an Asian or Chinese-American, who does not know the difference between a monarchy and a republic, who never read the Declaration of Independence or Webster's Spelling Book, making laws for Lydia Marie Childs, Lucretia Mott, and Fanny Kimball. Her argument was that immigrants and blacks were unqualified to vote, while white women of a certain class and privileges were qualified. And that's from an article by a colleague, Noel Trent. The language of the 15th Amendment is very interesting because it only contains two sections. And it basically says, let me see if I can get this down here. There was a discussion about including women. We talked about that, but it disregards gender. So the two sections of the 15th Amendment say the rights of a United States citizen to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So in this one stanza, you'd think, well, that includes everyone because citizens, we are citizens. However, Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. What's going to happen is the 14th Amendment is going to basically seek to strategize a gendered language. In essence, it's essential to understand that the 14th Amendment is 5 sections. So there were 3 Civil War amendments, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th. The 13th abolished slavery as a practice of holding persons in America. The 14th Amendment we're going to discuss really is the Equal Protection Clause under the law. There are 5 sections to it, but the real meat of it, or the greatest tooth, is the equal protection under the law. Then you have the 15th Amendment, which gave men, not just black men, all men, as we heard about Hans and others that she talked about. So it wasn't just simply black men. So we need to kind of understand that once again, as African Americans plod the ground and make the trails, others are following on the trail. They're not clearing the forest. African Americans have cleared it and others have been able to walk across it on the strength of our clearing it. That's another conversation. The second section mentions the word male. This is the first time in the entire United States Constitution that the word sex is mentioned. So when we look at section 1 of that particular 14th Amendment, and I've highlighted it for you, it's about life, liberty, or property without due process of law. You cannot deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within the jurisdiction equal protection under the law. This is going to be used as the largest knife to dismantle or cut up the idea of Jim Crow in the 20th century that the NAACP is going to use. And this is still an issue even the LGBT community use in terms of who and what a citizen is entitled to by due process of law. This will also be, of course, brought up with the Breonna Taylor situation, as well as all the other murders that have happened in terms of what exactly does this amendment say and how does that fit into our current body politic. Conversation for another time, trying to stay with the 15th Amendment. So the second section talks about it, and I've highlighted it for you, when the right to vote at any election for various offices on the federal level is denied male inhabitants, and then representation therein shall be reduced. Such male citizens shall be the whole number of the male citizens 21 years of age in such state. So they mention the idea of male 3 times, firmly cementing that women, not just white women, women were not going to be included in being able to make the decisions for the country. This is huge because what's going to happen with this particular fallout is going to be a fracture ideologically that's going to affect race relations in these movements that go into the 20th and 21st century. As I mentioned earlier, the photograph, this is from the Maryland Center for History and Culture, the former Maryland Historical Society. On May 19th in 1870, more than 10,000 persons gathered for the ratification of the 15th Amendment with an elaborate parade in Baltimore. Frederick Douglass did address this gathering. The Prince Hall Masons of Maryland were there, and they were resplendent in all of their regalia. And this is actually to the right of this stereograph is the Washington Monument. It's very blurry. I do apologize, but you probably could find it online as I did and look at it in a much smaller image. And that's where he's going to be talking and giving his oration about how happy they are now to have a vote and be fully recognized as citizens. And we know it's not without fight how that vote is going to be fought for. So now we get to the idea of the series of fractures in the suffrage movement. The 20th century inherited one that resulted in a fissure between the white and black women. The passage of the 19th Amendment cemented the ideological rift between the women's rights movement on one side and the larger human rights campaign for black women or by black women. Black women, as well as other African Americans, have always been inclusive and very concerned about other individuals because they understood marginalization could mean your extermination. So when you have a voice, you need to speak for everyone because you will soon be on the chopping block and there'll be no one to defend you. So we look at the 5 moments during this particular time. African American women entered the 20th century organized. They did not just randomly enter the 20th century unfocused and concerned. We have people that were involved in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s with abolition who were going to blossom into the suffrage movement. So we became organized in churches, civic groups, and other organizations. African American women were in all 3 generations of those who fought for the 19th Amendment. Dr. Rosalind Torborg Penn's work talks about the 3 generations of women, and she's chronicling African American women from the beginning all the way up to that 72-year fight in 1920. Racial slights, moment 3. And overt racism did not impede their progress in terms of the suffrage movement. We're going to have Ida B. Wells, who's going to participate in the 1913 suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. And even though she is verbally accosted by being told to march in the back with the other individuals who they want to Jim Crow, she slipped in with the Illinois delegation as a citizen and resident of Illinois to march with her delegation accordingly. At the same time, we're going to have HBCU women, historically black colleges and university women. Of note is Howard University's contingent of women. They were the first public act of Delta Sigma Theta sorority was to participate in the March Parade in 1913, along with Mary Church Terrell and T. Montgomery Gregory, a Howard University faculty member and alum as well. So once again, you find the synergy of both men and women as African Americans now fighting for the 19th Amendment as well. The 4th moment, the intersection of economics, education, and politics galvanized the urgency of the suffrage bill. So they understood, and Mary McLeod Bethune talks about this in 1904 with her school, when she realized how apportionments were being given out by the state of Florida. There was a degree of white schools getting $11 per child, where black schools were getting $3 per child, but we're all paying taxes. So the elected officials would then designate what they wanted to do. So she understood that there was something to that elected official and something to this ballot that now will shift the tide of being able to have public funds distributed equally. So it's always about money and power, as we saw from Charles Wesley in the colonial era, and we've come through now into the 20th century with the suffrage movement. Moment 5, Maryland did not ratify the 19th Amendment in line with other southern states, seeking to mute the voice and the votes of black women. As much as Maryland is in its mind blue and north leaning, it really is red and southern leaning in terms of some of its policies and politics, and we can discuss that later. So here we have pictured a Maryland daughter, native daughter of Maryland, my favorite poet, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. She was born on September 25th, 1825 in Baltimore City. She's the only child to her freeborn parents whose names are lost to history because they were not recorded. She was raised by her Uncle William and his wife, Aunt Henrietta. Her uncle, William, was very much involved in the AME Church, and he was a very outspoken abolitionist and human rights advocate. And he was also a school developer. He was an educator and had a school. So she was reared in a tradition of great activism, and this is going to influence her worldview. And it's going to lead her to be someone involved in suffrage, as well as abolitionist activities, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and such. So Frances Harper was a very profound voice, contemporary of Harriet Tubman, who eventually is going to be selected to replace her in the national narrative of suffrage because of this speech I'm getting ready to talk about. So in 1866, Harper delivers a speech called "We Are All Bound Up Together" before the National Women's Rights Convention. Her speech addressed the implicit bias, racial biases, within the women's movement prior to the passage of the 15th Amendment. And she is sharing some of her observations in this speech. She talks about the loss of her husband and the financial peril that it put her family in, and even wishing that she had died before him so the family could have money because he could make the money that could maintain the family. She chronicled the abuse Black women encountered without protection of law. And ultimately, the most profound element of her speech, I suggest you read it, you can find it online. She says, "I do not believe that giving the woman the ballot is going to immediately cure all of the ills of life. I do not believe that white women are dewdrops just exhaled from heaven. I think, like men, they may be divided into three classes: the good, the bad, and the indifferent. The good would vote according to their convictions and principles, the bad as dictated by prejudice or malice, and the indifferent will vote on the strongest side of the question, the winning party." This speech in particular is going to basically scrub away the legacy of Frances Harper from the 6-volume discussion on suffrage. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton sought to replace her by putting Harriet Tubman, who was born around the same era as Harper, and because of her more moderate views. Harriet was born enslaved on the Eastern Shore. Frances was born freeborn in Baltimore City. We know clearly, even now, how different those spaces are ideologically. One can only imagine 200 years ago what that must have been like to have been born and reared in the space of Eastern Shore versus Baltimore City. So then we now have to look at the NAACWC, because we talked about Black women's organizations being organized. They weren't just simply slapdash. The National Association of Colored Women's Clubs was founded in 1896, and they sought to provide advocacy and solution within the African American community, from employment to public representation to civil rights. The experience of African American club women can and came from an empowering socialization process and a particular understanding of womanhood. That's from Dr. Stephanie Shaw's work. As I said, there's a bibliography at the end for you to look at. But the idea that Black women, irrespective of their complexion, and you see multiple complexions here with this picture that was taken, and in the center is Mary McLeod Bethune, and there's Mary Church Terrell and other individuals in this picture. Regardless of their complexion, their station, their education, their class, they were treated in a derogatory fashion because they were Black. The one-drop rule made them almost tarnished and tainted. So they understood from the socialization process, whether you're dressed in linen or whether you're dressed in sackcloth, you were an African American and you were subpar. Here is a picture of Mary Church Terrell. She is the first national president of the NACW. She's also going to be that person who participated in that parade in 1913 with the Howard University delegation. She traveled nationally and internationally, speaking on the quest for human rights for African Americans. She also participated in direct action protests, as I mentioned, and then she was fluent in 3 languages. I believe German was one of them, and she was in Germany and gave a speech in German and talked about the African American experience. They didn't believe she was because she was so fair. They thought she was a white woman. And she made it very clear that she was an African and that her skin was basically a map to what the experience of the African has been in North America. And so she had broad appeal and understanding and sought to liberate African people and equitize Black women throughout her life. In this particular lovely image of her, and so you can see she was married to a judge, by the way, Judge Robert Terrell. So she comes from an upper middle class environment, but she was born, I believe, in Tennessee. So her reality was very clear on the vertical relationship between Black and white, and very clear that she knew her privilege empowered her to speak for those who did not have the luxury or the liberty to speak for themselves. In that 1915 crisis, she wrote, "Even if I believe that women should be denied the right of suffrage, wild horses could not drag such an admission from my pen or my lips. More and more, it is beginning to be understood that the mother's zeal for the ballot is prompted by her solicitude for her family circle, that the child's food may be pure, that his environment shall be wholesome, and his surroundings be sanitary. These are the things which engage her. The ballot the sign of power, the means by which things are brought to pass, the talisman that makes our dreams come true. Her demand, votes for women, is votes for children. Now, one could question, is this 2020 or is this 1915? Because those elements of food, access, environmental cleanliness, and sanitary, whether it be emotional or physical safety, are all issues we're still dealing with in contemporary African American culture. So we have then the NAWSA, a shallow victory. In 1870, the white suffragists split into two groups as a result of the 15th Amendment. The American Women's Suffrage Association, which was primarily more interracial in its makeup, sought to go state by state to gain suffrage for women. The other group that was principally with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who were slightly more bigoted in their perspective, and they had blacks with them, so they weren't solely white. There were other blacks who were sympathetic to their cause, was the National Women's Suffrage Association. And they wanted federal legislation, and they wanted the women's agenda to be solely the focus of their entire move. So by 1890, the AWSA and the NWSA conceded that a unified advocacy for the franchise would be best. They developed a compromise that brought more conservative strategies, which moved away from various feminine issues to, oops, let me go back again, getting too happy on the trigger here, feminist issues to focus on women winning the vote. One of the strategies was to ignore the priorities of Black women, an expedient tactic designed to bring white Southern women who did not relish the idea of encouraging Black women to vote. Despite the movement to alienate African American women, several Black women continued to attend the NAWSA. Mary Church Terrell, as well as Mary McLeod Bethune, would make overtures to them throughout the course of this, while others concentrated their efforts on convincing their people, African American people, that gaining political rights for Black women was a means to solving social and economic problems of the race. So once again, those Black clubs that came into the 20th century went insular and sought to build up within their community, while others sought to be liaisons to the interracial world. And this is from Dr. Rosalind Torborg's pen and her book, which is a seminal work and a foundational work on analyzing Black suffrage activity. Out of the NAWSA becomes the League of Women Voters. Now, many of us might be familiar with them, and that's very important to understand that this organization that basically grew out of a fracture over the 15th Amendment that now realigns itself with another fracture is now going to morph into another organization. Carrie Chapman Catt, pictured on your screen to the left, is going to be the founder. And in February of 1920, she's going to say to finish the fight. That is what she wanted. I propose a League of Women Voters, nonpartisan, non-sectarian, to finish the fight and to aid in the reconstruction of the nation. What should be done can be done. Let us do it. And this is from a book by Dr. Jefferson Jenkins. She was the first African-American president of the League of Women Voters. She held 2 terms from 1998 to 2002, and she wrote a salient book this year that just came out on her experience with the League of Women Voters and their issues of race. So we have here the League inheritance included a fracture and seeks to answer the question, are all women the same? Viewing themselves as representative of organized women, the League's leaders sought to transform the enthusiasm for a common goal into collective commitment to more limited but specific goals. Internal indifferences arose, which, if hastened the development of procedures for reconciling conflicts, exacted an emotional toll. More difficult to absorb was the reaction of older suffrage leaders whose millennial hopes were not realized or immediately realized. Despite its ability to reconcile its internal organizational issues of race, gender, and its legacy of separatism from the NAWSA, the League continued to position itself as, quote unquote, every woman's organization, even while its own ideology reflected segregated membership, not in its bylaws, understand, in its operations, in a de facto manner. And Jefferson Jenkins goes further to talk about the relationship with the League and its African-American memberships was more transactional than transformational. So we need to have so many people at the table or in the committee, we are now going to reach out to you. But we're not going to participate in the anti-lynching. We're not going to participate in the World War II efforts about fair housing. We're not going to participate in the civil rights movement. We're going to close our eyes to those things and let you kind of solve it on your own. Of note, for those who are interested in this, Jefferson Jenkins talks about how the League created a Negro Problems Committee and in the 1940s, and there was advocacy within the League to say, let's change the term of this committee because it just is inherently bigoted. Long history there. Back to Maryland in terms of the 19th Amendment. So the federal legislation did not set well with select state officials in Maryland. And Baltimore Judge Oscar Lesser, who is pictured here, sued to have the names of 2 women removed from the registry rolls. In a unanimous decision on February 27, 1922, the court found, this is the United States Supreme Court, by the way, he went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, found that the 50th Amendment, once again, the 50th Amendment had stood for 50 years, proving that voting rights could be extended. Federal law overruled state laws on the issue of voting. So his point was moot. Maryland is not going to ratify the 19th Amendment until March 29, 1941. And they're not going to certify that till 1958, February 25th. So as much as Maryland calls itself blue-leaning north, the behaviors of some individuals were really red-leaning conservative or south. Furthermore, towards this discussion, Black women became voters. They lobbied for political candidates, organized voter education groups, and in their own communities ran for elected office. So we look at the 5 moments in this particular time period. We're going to have the legal challenges orchestrated by the NAACP slowly dismantle Jim Crow in a state-by-state fashion, while voting rights organizations waged state-by-state battles as well. The third generation of suffragists had modeled and mentored young women into agency, a greater agency. So during World War II, you're going to see a number of organizations, both sororities as well as church groups, and we'll talk about Victorine Adams in a minute, who are doing that kind of work. Victorine Adams, in the tradition of Baltimore City school teachers, organizes the Colored Women's Democratic Campaign Committee. And then you're going to have Fannie Lou Hamer, Victoria Gray Adams, and Annie Devine representing the first national partisan crusade for political office in the 20th century. And then by moment number 5, you're going to have the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which was a direct result of the increasing visibility and vocality of African American women. So even though we see men at the front of the civil rights movement, we don't discount them for their sacrifice and contribution. It is Black women, and we're going to learn about some of them in a minute, who physically put themselves in the way to advocate and agitate for change. So Victorine Q. Adams was a charter member of the Baltimore section of the National Council of Negro Women. She was acquainted with Mrs. Mary McLeod Bethune and heartily embraced her vision of universal suffrage. Toward this end, in 1946, she founds the Colored Women's Democratic Campaign Committee. The CWDCC believed in making the political process relatable, engaging the entire community, men, women, and children about the ballot, and increasing civic consciousness and political accountability. Here she is pictured in her home with members of her club. She is the petite woman against the wall, with a man named Philip Goodman, who was going to run for an office, and she would actually invite the candidates to her home to address her committee. And that's a very powerful position, and I've learned that she did this up until the 1990s. She passes away in 06, but the idea that they said if you didn't get her approval in certain candidate positions in Baltimore City, you weren't going to win. So she was able to, from the 40s up until the 1990s, over 50 years, build a level of integrity and reputation for Black women's voting, as well as the African American electorate or registered voters. So the CWDCC is meeting with Charles Tilden, who is standing, and their motto was, if democracy is worth fighting for, it's worth voting for. So the members sought to welcome all women, register all women, enlighten all, and interest more women in politics, stimulate and educate the public on the value of the ballot, register more people, get the vote out at election time, but also to take part in the civic, political, and social progress of the city. And that's from my book. But the idea was that it's not an electoral moment. We need to be vigilant throughout the course of it. Eternal vigilance was the name of what I talked about to begin with. And that's what needs to happen so that these candidates would even get on the ballots to cause the strife they caused legislatively. So now we have to look at the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. This was founded on April 26 in 1964 as a voter registration project for African Americans in Mississippi. The voter suppression in Mississippi resulted in physical economic, and fatal attacks on African Americans who attempted to exercise their 15th and 19th Amendment rights. So once again, the federal law said we could do certain things. But if we go back to what Wesley said about the citizen, that seemingly has been a bugaboo as that opaque definition continues to resonate in certain states who feel that their rights are sovereign as a state, and the federal government cannot impose upon the state what the state wants to do. So a coalition of college students, residents of Mississippi, the NAACP officers, and the Black press sought to end that practice. What is the igniting incidents? So some of you from a certain generation will know what this photograph is. The murders of Michael H. Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney in the summer of '64 impelled the urgency to end the murderous retribution African-American voting registration had caused. So they were now killing white people. And the civil rights movement, because of the technology with cameras and footage, are able to now see in live time the violence and the utter gall that is executed upon African Americans and, quote, N-word loving whites who are coming south to just simply register people to vote. Toward this end, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party organized a slate of delegates that would go to the 1964 Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey, to challenge the constitutionality, federal constitutionality, of the all-white Democratic delegation from Mississippi. Enter one of my heroes, Fannie Lou Hamer. She's going to be considered the leader of this particular delegation. She's a native of Mississippi. She would not be allowed to register to vote till the age of 44. And once she was able to understand that she had the right, because there was a certain degree of ignorance, she was 19 of her parents' 20 children. So she did not have access to a level of formal education. And then there was, again, all the violence attached to it that in the state of Mississippi is very large as well. She was sold out. Once she was bought into the idea, she dedicated the remainder of her life to advocacy about social inequity, as well as the vote. She was fearless, tireless, spiritually grounded, and a justice advocate. She endured physical beatings, threats, and economic challenges from her voting rights advocacy. Nevertheless, she persisted, and she was a married woman with children, so she had persons that could be hurt vicariously by her activity, and she continued. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic delegation included Victoria Gray Adams and Annie Devine. They're pictured below. This is an iconic image of them. Other members of the original delegation included Lawrence Guillot, who I had the pleasure of knowing, Aaron Henry, Bob Moses, a classmate from high school, that's her dad, and Peggy J. Connor and Edwin King. So these are people that I actually could know, but did not really make that connection to their importance of putting their physical selves in spaces of harm so that we could have the right to vote. Even though it was on the books, but to make the law accountable and actually do what it says it's supposed to do. This contingent included Native Mississippians, civil rights activists, and student leaders. Hamer's testifying before the Democratic National Convention is one of the most salient speeches in the 20th century. Once again, you also can find this online. Throughout her presentation, she describes the beating that she received in prison. She was arrested when she returned to Mississippi. And when she was in prison, they actually had male prisoners. The police guards brought in 2 male prisoners to physically beat her, 2 African-American men, by the way, to add insult to injury, to beat her. And they showed no mercy. And as a result, she says, all of this on account of we want to register to become first-class citizens. And if the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party is not seated, I question America. Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave? Our lives be threatened daily because we want to live as decent human beings in America? And you need to hear her say it, that this speech was electrifying because it comes from her bare soul. Hamer's impassioned speech contributed to the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And this is an article from a colleague, Dr. Blaine. Hamer had pulled back the curtain. The United States could not claim to be a democracy while withholding voting rights from millions of its citizens. Although the MFDP delegation did not secure any of its intended seats, it compelled President Lyndon B. Johnson, who interrupts the speech that Hamer is giving on national television, to introduce federal legislation that is going to ban local laws like literacy tests and other things that were used to block African Americans from the ballot. So here we have President Lyndon Baines Johnson with Dr. Martin Luther King, and of course to his left is Ralph Abernathy after signing the Voting Rights Act. Now I also want to note that there's a lovely woman in this black and white checkered outfit is Patricia Roberts Harris, Howard University graduate. You can tell I said love the bison, but she was the first Secretary of the Housing and Urban Affairs Development Agency. So this Voting Rights Act would now allow a generation of women to get into these federal positions because of qualification, not because of any kind of tokenism, skilled to do the work, now being given the access to be able to exercise that ability. So as we come to a conclusion, and we look at the idea of equality is won and not bestowed, I must go back to Dr. Dwight Oliver Wendell Holmes, Morgan University or Morgan College president, 1937 to 1948. And he wrote, with faith in God, with confidence in our fellow men, and with an educated and alert younger generation coming on, I believe that we can face the future unafraid, and with a considered belief that we will win all that we deserve, and we shall attain full freedom. This was written, I believe, in the 1950s. This is the legacy of the long struggle for the 15th and 19th Amendment. In 2020, we commemorate the 150th and the 100th anniversaries of those two constitutional amendments. I would like to share with you my bibliography. I'll let that freeze on the screen for a while. I know it's a little small, but there's some great rich work out there that you should be able to look at and maybe take a screenshot of. And then I also want to say thank you once again and hope that something shared will inspire you to vote and to share this rich history of agency with your community. Thank you.
This document is the U.S. Constitution. It is the document that governs everything that we do in everyday life. The question becomes, how many of us actually have ever read the U.S. Constitution? How many of us know what is in it? How many of us know just how significant voting and elections are in improving this document? We're going to find out. So the first thing I would like for you to do after this is over is to go out and get a copy or do it online of the U.S. Constitution. This one costs about maybe $1 or so, depending on if you want to get them in bulk. What I actually do is take it with me wherever I go. And with COVID, I now make sure as I take extras and leave them places that I also provide the protections with it. So as we're going through, there are some things I want you to do right away. I want you to think about 10 things that you care about, your family cares about, and that you care about for this nation. And make a list of those 10 things and keep them with you at all times. The U.S. Constitution was founded by some men who, as we all know, were not perfect. And the document itself is also not perfect. The one perfect part of it is we, the people. So I would like to read to you the foresight that some of these founding fathers had in regards to why the Constitution is so important. And I'm going to quote from Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. Okay, here we go. A primary object should be the education of our youth in the science of government. In a republic, that species of knowledge can be equally important. And what duty more pressing than communicating it to those who are to be the future guardians of the liberties of the country? That is why this document is so important for our future. The good sense of the people will always be found to be the best army. They may be led astray for a moment, but will soon correct themselves. Present day events. We in America do not have government by the majority. We have government by the majority who participate. All tyranny needs to gain a foothold is for people of good conscience to remain silent. That is why it is so important to know your Constitution and to vote. So we have the breakdown of the Constitution as follows. The first articles, and they're articles, there are 7 of them. And they're sort of like if you have a company and you need to register it and you develop these articles of your corporation, that is what your constitution usually is. And then after that, you have your bylaws, which are opportunities to improve and make sure that your constitution is in sync with current times, or if there need to be other similar changes. The U.S. Constitution is the same way. It has articles, and then it has amendments. The interesting thing about the U.S. Constitution is that the articles are all Roman numerals. I don't even know if students are learning Roman numerals anymore, but I love it because there are lots of I's in those numbers. And I, the capital I, becomes very important as we address the U.S. Constitution and the roles that African Americans play in it. So very quickly, the first I, which is Article 1, is the legislative branch. The second I, the executive branch. The third I, judicial. The fourth I, the states. The fifth I, how to adopt amendments. And then there's 6 and 7 that deal with debt and ratification of the first Constitution. Then we have the amendments. The first 10 amendments are called the Bill of Rights. And many of us know about the Bill of Rights. Freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, the right to bear arms, no unreasonable search and seizure, deals with trial, deals with punishment. Cruel and unusual punishment is not allowed, a speedy trial, your rights to cross-examine witnesses. Many of those things are in the Bill of Rights. So you have the articles that deal with how the government governs its people, and you have the Bill of Rights that says to the government, hold up, wait a minute, there's certain rights of which you cannot infringe upon. So that's the first 10. Many of us know about mainly the first 7 or 8 of the first 10. For African Americans, yes, they are very, very, very important. What is also important are the amendments that come after that. Because we also have such amendments as the 13th Amendment, slavery is abolished, the 14th Amendment that provides us citizenship, privileges, due process, equal protection, 14th Amendment. 15th Amendment allowed our African American men the ability to vote. We have the 19th Amendment, which allows our women the right to vote. We then have the 16th, which I skipped because that's about taxes. Yes, that's in there too. We also have other rights that are in amendments, such as voting rights for D.C., and even though they're not a state yet, the fact is the foot's in the door. And so that's very, very important. We have the 24th that permanently repealed the poll tax in voting. And we have the 26th Amendment, which is changing the voting age from 21 to 18. And then there are also amendments that talk about who should succeed, who's in line if there's a situation about the executive branch and they can't fulfill obligations and duties and that type of thing. So we actually have many amendments that govern our daily lives. In addition to the Constitution and its amendments, there are then other things that the 3 branches of government include to also help to govern us, and that we have fought as African Americans even more so. So the way that I would like to address that is going to be as follows. We're going to start, I've got this little plant here. I've got these flowers in this plant. I'm going to show it to you real quickly and then I'll back away. Okay. So here we've got the Supreme Court, which is the 3rd branch, the judicial branch. And there are actually 9 eyes that are in this plant because there currently are 9 Supreme Court justices. There are numerous laws that affect us that I will talk about in just a moment in regards to the judicial system. Now, we also have the Senate. So there are 2 of these. which currently right now is red. We have the House of Representatives, which is by population, so there are more of those. That's blue. We have the executive branch, which I have as a black rose. And then we have all of these other groups, such as the LGBTQ community. We also have our women's rights. We have immigrant rights. We have Native American rights. We also have rights for disability, discrimination, anti-discrimination against age. There are many groups that are now protected. And the reason they are protected is because of this group right here. These are African Americans. This is us. And the reason that this is so important is because our symbol I have here, the cotton of which we toiled and which is the main reason why they brought us here in slavery, we toiled the soil in order to earn the right to be part of we the people. And we also have pine cones. Pine cones are known as a third eye. Pine cones are known as that extra sensory that can see things that no one else can see, that provides insight that no one else has. And so, physically speaking, there is a third eye that many of us have in terms of intuition and insight. As African Americans, we have our younger folk, and then we got a little white hair here for some of our more veterans who have really struggled. And the reason that I waited is because we are the ones that make sure everybody else is included. Because the rights that we fight for, when we get them, so does a whole lot of other people, and they get them much easier than we. Oftentimes, we are the ones that put in the struggle, and it is for the benefit of everyone, because we, the people, is all inclusive. But here's something that we need to make sure we do, and we haven't done it well recently. It is important that we continue to nurture and spray all of the branches of government, not just one. But it appears that what's happened recently is that we have not really been watering all of our branches, but there are others who have only singled out certain branches. And so we have a bouquet that needs some uplifting, and that is what this election is going to help us do. So let's talk a little bit more about the powers that we have in the government. So again, the first article is the first article talks about the legislative branch. The legislative branch, we're up in it right in the very beginning. And how so? Because the first article talks about representation. And that's what brings in the census, because for representation in the House, the number of representatives you have is based on population. And in Article 1, the reference to African Americans is not a full person yet. It is 3/5 of a person. How did that come about? Because as they were formulating representatives for the House, the southern states realized that they had all these people and no representation. So they wanted the slaves to be counted. They wanted them to be counted, but they didn't want to pay the taxes for them. Because again, as I said, we also have the article that deals with taxes. They didn't want to pay the taxes, but they wanted the representation. So this 3/5 compromise came about. And it is in the Constitution that provides a 3/5 vote. Now some people, I'm one to say, that's more than half. Our Bigfoot is in it, which means we're going to be all in it It's a matter of when. And for some who don't like that, they may say, there goes the neighborhood. What I say is, it's the neighborhood to the rescue. Because again, when we come in, we bring the army with us. We bring everybody in because everyone is part of we the people. So it is very important with the two houses of government. We have the House and we have the Senate. The House representatives are elected every 2 years. Every 2. And it's based on population. The census is done every 10 years. So we have to, whatever numbers end up in regards to the census, and census also include many services going to communities, but it also determines how many representatives each state gets. And if we undercount, that's 10 years of undercount. That's 10 years of representation of which we're not getting our full pledge. So that is why the census is so very important, because in the House, that determines how many representatives you get. How many folks know how many representatives they have in their state? I'm just asking a question, but I think it's important to find out if you don't. The House has the ability to impeach. However, in regards to removing a member of the executive branch, they have to do that in the Senate. Now, our senators are elected every 6 years. And that wasn't always the case. It used to be that the senators had a different way that didn't involve us voting for them in order to be chosen as senators. But currently, our senators, we vote. Each state has 2. Each state has 2. And they serve 6 years. That's 6 years. And they serve staggered terms. So unless there's a special election needed, you will not have 2 senators running the same time. Do you know who your 2 senators are? Do you know how long they've been there? Do you know when they're up again for election? Because the power of the Senate, I think, is where we need to pay some strict attention. The reason being, with Supreme Court justices, the only 2 branches that have say is the president who chooses and the Senate who votes thumbs up or thumbs down. And they call it advice and consultation, so chances are the vote's going to be up more so than down. The House has nothing to do with that process. Supreme Court justices are appointed for life. Hindsight, foresight, insight, seems to me there's something that needs to be done in terms of the Senate. And we don't have in the state of Maryland, there aren't any senators up this year, but we got midterms coming. And with the census, the current census that's going on right now is not going to affect this election 2020, it will affect the midterms. So let's put that all together and see what needs to happen. We need to find out of our wish list that you made, what are the senators doing that you know of to help you get your list taken care of? Or have we even asked them to give us any kind of accountability? House, because the House runs every 2 years, the chances are because they have to run every 2, there's more activity that goes on in the House. And so there are more town halls that come on, and it's generally during election season, but at least every 2 years you see them. The Senate is different, 6 years, 6 years. So if there's time to do some things and to make some changes, that is the time. In regards to our judicial and the Supreme Court, we've got quite a few cases that are all up in this Constitution. And I'm going to just read some of them to you so that you can then look them up. We've got Dred Scott. We have Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus Board of Education. We have the Bakke situation. We have the Bush versus Gore. We have the Affordable Care Act. We have Roe versus Wade. And there's also a Supreme Court case in reference to Japanese internment that I would like for you to take a look at and to read. Because we're asking for things in regards to reparations, some of the demands that we want. And there was a Supreme Court case that dealt with Japanese internment. The outcome is something that is not as clear as some may think. So that is why I encourage you to read it. Now, again, we have the question with the Supreme Court, which is, well, what happens when we don't like what the Supreme Court does? Your House and Senate have the ability to overturn by way of passing laws that will take care of whatever Supreme Court decisions you may like. When a Supreme Court decision comes out, you know what I do? I kind of know already what the winning vote is saying. I go to the dissent, because oftentimes the dissent gives you a clue about the arguments for the winners, the arguments for what they consider the losers, and what might be coming up soon or next in states in regards to overturning a dissent into making it law by decisions with the Constitution. So it is extremely important that we pay attention to those decisions that come down from the judicial branch of government. Now, back to on the executive side, what is important is that the executive has the power to issue executive orders. Now, what is so important about executive orders, and as we have witnessed in present time, executive orders come and go with the administration, whoever is the administration. So an executive order that was passed by one branch of the executive government in 1 year, a new executive comes in, either they can let it stand or just undo it, repeal it, change it, or whichever. But they don't stay in stone. They're not in stone. It is very important for us to recognize that the power of the executive is crucial when it comes to executive orders. One great example, Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation was like an executive order, and it was designed to free the slaves in the Confederate States in order to fight for the Union. And so those states were, the slaves were freed. But it was limited to during the Civil War. And there was question about, once the war was over, what would happen now to those freed slaves? And in order to make certain that those slaves did not go, those freedmen did not go back into slavery, they had to pass, Abe Lincoln had to get Congress to pass the 13th Amendment. So that is how we got the 13th Amendment, based on an executive order that the president felt needed to be secured. So there are ways in which to make an executive order standing firm for a long period of time. We also want to make sure that we have the right representatives and senators in Congress, because so many acts that affect us as African Americans are the 13th and 14th Amendment, collectively, particularly so, and the Voting Rights Amendment, 15th, 19th. So what we have amendments, and then Congress passes what is considered to be congressional acts, ACTS, congressional acts, to enforce, to enhance, to help to broaden or limit, depending on the circumstances, the rights that fall under those amendments. So Voting Rights and Civil Rights Acts have basically been improved through congressional acts. And such things as anti-KKK acts. There were 3 of those during Reconstruction that were passed. And it basically provided penalties for any discriminations around voting. It put elections under federal control and made sure that there was federal enforcement north and south. We have public accommodations. We have African Americans and the right not to be excluded from juries. We have women and civil rights And we also have the EEOC, the Office of Civil Rights. We have the Americans with Disabilities Act that helps with Americans with disabilities. We have the Fair Housing Act. We have HUD. We also, in terms of voting, these acts deal with literacy tests, poll taxes, again, providing the national government to come in and intervene. We have protections now in voting and civil rights for Native Americans, Hispanics, Asians, you name it, the disabled, the illiterate, bilingual voting ballots, things of that sort are all part of congressional acts. Now, that's the good news. The troubling news about it, congressional acts sunset. Congressional acts generally don't last more than 5 or 6 years. Sometimes in the act it may give extensions more, but many times it doesn't. We've got the Affordable Care Act that is going up again before the Supreme Court because it's an act. We also have the 1965 Voting Rights Act that we haven't been able to improve upon for many years since the Supreme Court backed away from some of the strengths that we had before. And that is because those have to continue to be reauthorized. And when we don't reauthorize them, they go away, those protections go away. Unless we find ways to make them more solid, which is to put them into the U.S. Constitution as amendments. Speaking of voting and speaking of amendments, I want to make sure that I share these two things with you. Keith Wright, who is he's a writer, he's an artist, and I believe he currently has a show called Woke. The Syracuse Cultural Workers is a group that organizes paraphernalia and peace things, and they have calendars and things of that sort. This calendar, this is a calendar page, it's called Voter Suppression, Bingo. And the way I like to play this game is not to cover up, but to uncover so that they no longer have these restrictions. So you say bingo, you cover your board, and then you say bingo once you can say your state has removed all of these. And you have everything from only one machine per polling place, a 4.5-hour wait, no early voting, polling place delayed openings, fake voicemails, you've been purged, gerrymandering, you name it, blatant intimidation. Those are ways in which people have tried to prevent us from voting. So again, with this bingo card, we want to strip all of these away so the states don't have them. Speaking of amendments, wouldn't it be great for us to actually pass a Voters' Bill of Rights? This is from the globalexchange.org and voicejustice.org, and it is actually a Voters' Bill of Rights. We shall have a constitutional amendment confirming the right to vote. We shall count every vote, secure and verify electronic voting system. We shall make Election Day registration available and Election Day a national holiday. How about that? We shall increase diversity of candidates, increase ballot access. We shall have committee election representatives in the electorate, nonpartisan redistricting. Those are just a few things. Talking about amendments, would this not be great? So what is very important for us to remember is how very important the U.S. Supreme Court, the President, Executive Branch, and all of our representatives in the House and Senate, how important they are. And another area, before we go, has to deal with the Electoral College. There's been an awful lot of talk about doing away with the Electoral College. And I'm one to say, before we go there, let's take a look and see how it's actually operating today and whether or not, while they're busy waiting to change the Constitution, we can have some influence. So the census also affects your Electoral College. Your Electoral College actually is who determines who your president is. We found that out in recent times. Popular vote is very important, but electoral college is what really, really makes the decision. And they make the decision after Election Day. So the bulk of African Americans the bulk of us live in southern states. Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia, Maryland, which is considered up south by many, South Carolina, Alabama, North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, Florida, Arkansas. If you were to take a look at the number of electors that are in those southern states and add some other states that we know are pretty, we have a lot of people, which would be like California, New York, Illinois, New Jersey. In order for a president to become elected, 270 is the magic number. 270. So as we talk about the importance of elections, the Electoral College is the best kept secret in the world because they're the ones that determine who's going to actually be the president, but we don't know who they are either. And so what is so very important, particularly in those states where the majority of us live, this is where the majority of us live, it is important to find out a little bit more about that Electoral College and see how can I become an elector? Because electors have power. They have more power than many others. So let's think about that. There were so many other things I wanted to say, but the main thing I want to make sure that we do is to take full advantage of knowing the Constitution. Because as I say, I have a shirt that says it, danger, educated black woman. And I think it is important to say danger, educated voter, because all of us need to understand the vote. And in order to pass any kind of amendment constitutionally, just because the House and Senate passes it, it doesn't become law until the percentage of states pass it. And so just like ask the folks with the Equal Rights Amendment, to this day they are still trying to get that passed because they did not get enough states to agree to the Equal Rights Amendment in the time in which was imposed upon for it to be done. And they were a few states short. I think now Virginia has just passed it. The timing is something of which is in question, so they may need to start over. We don't know. But what we do know is that it all comes back to the votes we make at home. So down ticket is as important, if not more so, than up ticket. Because all of those decisions are so very importantly made by politicians, and those politicians do it for if there's the power that we actually impose upon them to do what we want to do. So some other things that also we care about: child labor laws, death penalty, reparations. We also have the, as said, the Affordable Care Act. But here's something too about these. There have been mandates before that have gone national. Seatbelts, y'all remember? You remember the cars where you had no choice as to whether or not to buckle up because they did it for you? That's because government determined, they asked us to protect ourselves, protect our families, and it just wasn't happening, and there were too many deaths caused by car accidents. And so we had a mandate, and the mandate had to do with seatbelts. Now, there's no longer that mandate in terms of anything that's in the law. Nationally speaking, you still get a ticket though. If they pull you over and your seatbelt isn't fastened, you're gonna be fined. Smoking ban is another. It used to be that there were no restrictions on cigarette smoke. There was a determination in terms of the adverse effect on not just the smoker, but the smoker and others around. That there were mandates that had been put in place. So wearing a mask to protect yourself and everyone around you is nothing new. in regards to a mandate. Sometimes the government says we just can't take care of ourselves, and there's something so important that we must take care of you for your sake. And that's what happened. So I'm getting ready to go vote. Actually, I've already voted. And I'm a voter protection person, so I'm actually going to help other people to vote. So I got my mask. I got my backpack. I got my backpack. I got my tote bag. I got this hat. Hello. Right there. I got all of my sanitizing things that are in my bag. And I got my fan. I got my own flower because I'm important. But guess what, y'all? I got problems. You know, my mama always said, and my grandmama, everybody else, don't you go walking outside without your shoes being tied. I have untied shoelaces. My shoelaces are untied. Now, I said about the Constitution, the I is about where do I belong? Where do I belong in all of this? It all depends on where I put myself as I. Proper noun, possessive, me, I. So I can walk around with my shoes untied, like untied states of America, or I can tie my shoes and be a part of the United States of America. And the difference in being untied, which is unfocused, which means I can't even look up, I gotta look down, I might trip over, I might fall back. Untied is where you put the I. The I. I can be untied or I can be united. I'm choosing to be part of the United States of America. I'm going to go and help people vote. I'm also going to shout out to anybody who thinks that they're going to prevent us from voting. So let's get busy. Vote. Your life depends on it, as your family and this country. See ya.
Hi, my name is Savannah Wood. I'm the Executive Director of Afro Charities, and I vote because it's one of the most important tools in our democracy to have our voices heard. So this November, I'm really excited for some of the local measures that are on the ballot, as well as voting for president, because I know from the local standpoint, that's where we really get to push our own issues forward. And on the federal standpoint, for the presidential election, there's so much at stake there, especially now that we have a vacancy on the Supreme Court. So I'm really excited to cast my vote and to use the power that I have as an individual to help shape the future of the country.
Wow, what an awesome presentation. My name is Dr. Ada Nkwante, and I'm one of the commissioners on the Maryland Commission of African American History and Culture. Wasn't that a wonderful Black Vote Symposium? That was wonderful. That was amazing. The upcoming election is going to be a historic one. It is going to be a historic one. And I am so excited at the good voting history we're just about to make. I am really excited. So thank you so much to our sponsors. Thank you to the presenters. Thank you to my fellow commissioners. Thank you to the Banneker-Douglass Foundation. Thank you to the Governor's Office of Community Initiatives. And most importantly, thank you to everyone who took out time this afternoon to be with us today. Thank you so, so very much. Please remember to go out and vote. It is very important. Everybody has to go out and vote. Drag somebody with you, please. Remind somebody, call people, make sure that everybody goes out to vote. Everybody you know who is eligible to vote in your area,
Please take them. Make sure that they do go get and vote. Please, it is so important. The census is also going on. It actually was postponed, so it's now all the way to October 31st. We all must get counted, so make sure you get counted. This is so important because it is our voice. Thank you. Hope everyone has a great evening. Thank you so much and goodbye.
Hello, my name is Sabria Hassan and I'm the Director of Programs at the Banneker-Douglass Museum. As you can probably imagine, the team and I spend a lot of time planning the museum's programs and events, so it only made sense that we create a plan for voting. To date, over 28 million people have already early voted. It's inspiring to know that the democratic process is alive and functioning in our country. If you have not done so already, creating a plan is easy. Here's a step-by-step checklist to get you to the polls on November 3rd. Number 1, I'm registered to vote. Hopefully by now you have already registered to vote. The deadline for the state of Maryland was October 13th. However, if you have not already registered, Maryland is a state that allows you to register and cast a provisional ballot the day of the election. For more information on this and other voter information, you can visit www.elections.maryland.gov. Number 2, I have identification just in case I need it. 3, I've researched my local races and ballot initiatives. 4, I've encouraged my friends and loved ones to register to vote and have created a plan with them. 5, I have saved the election protection hotline number just in case you experience any problems at the polls on the election day. Number 6, I've requested my mail-in ballot or located my polling place. 7, I have sent my ballot off and confirmed that it has been received. 8, I've spoken to my place of employment and shared with them my plans for voting on November 3rd. I've secured transportation, childcare, etc. Anything that could possibly be a hindrance on the day of has been thought out and taken care of. Number 9, you're ready to vote. Because on November 3rd, we want no voter left behind. We look forward to seeing you at the polls.